4 decades, 64 muscle cars built with speed, danger, and zero forgiveness. These are the deadliest machines each era unleashed. The 1960s didn't just change music and culture. It gave birth to the deadliest machines ever to roll off American assembly lines. Cars so powerful, so raw, so utterly unhinged that they terrified insurance companies and thrilled a generation hungry for speed. These weren't transportation. They were weapons with license plates. Today, we're counting down the 16 deadliest 60s muscle cars ever made. The monsters that defined an era and rewrote the rules of American performance forever. Number 16. The 1964 Pontiac GTO. Everything has to start somewhere, and the muscle car era started here. The 1964 Pontiac GTO wasn't the first powerful car, but it was the first to combine intermediate-sized body, big block power, and affordable pricing into a package that anyone could buy. General Motors had a corporate rule prohibiting engines larger than 330 cubic inches in mid-sized cars. But Pontiac's chief engineer John DeLorean found a loophole. By offering the GTO as an option package rather than a standalone model, he bypassed the restriction and changed automotive history forever. Under the hood sat a 389 cubic inch V8, producing 325 horsepower in standard form, or 148 horses with the optional tri-power carburetor setup. That might not sound earth-shattering today, but in 1964, dropping that kind of power into a 3,200-pound Tempest body created something genuinely dangerous. The chassis wasn't designed for this much torque. The brakes were barely adequate. The suspension geometry dated back to the 50s. None of that mattered to the kids lining up at Pontiac dealerships with cash in hand. The GTO's deadliness came from its accessibility. This wasn't an exotic race car or limited edition special. It was an option package that any 19-year-old with a part-time job could finance. Suddenly, incredible power was democratized, available to drivers with minimal experience and even less respect for consequences. The car could hit 60 miles per hour in 6.6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the low 15-second range. More importantly, it looked fantastic doing it, with aggressive styling that announced its intentions from a block away. Pontiac expected to sell maybe 5,000 GTOS in that first year. They sold over 32,000. Every other manufacturer immediately scrambled to create their own muscle car offerings, igniting an arms race that would define the decade. The GTO proved that Americans wanted power, style, and performance at prices they could afford. It established the template. Take a mid-sized car, stuff in the biggest engine available, add some styling flourishes, and watch them fly out of showrooms. The 1964 GTO's lasting impact cannot be overstated. It started everything. Without this car, there would be no Chevelle SS, no Roadrunner, no Charger, no muscle car golden age. It was deadly not just because of its performance, but because it opened the floodgates. Today, these first-year GTOs are highly collectible, with pristine examples commanding six-figure prices. They represent the moment when everything changed, when American automotive culture shifted into high gear and never looked back. Number 15, the 1968 Oldsmobile 442 W30. While other muscle cars got more attention, the Oldsmobile 442 quietly built a reputation as one of the most balanced and capable performance machines of the 60s. The 1968 model year brought the W30 option package, and suddenly this sophisticated bruiser became genuinely deadly. The 442 name originally stood for 4-barrel carburetor, 4-speed transmission, and dual exhausts, a formula that worked brilliantly throughout the decade. The W30 package added serious hardware to an already impressive foundation. Under the hood was the 400 cubic inch V8, force-fed by a Rochester quadrajet carburetor and producing 360 horsepower. But the real secret was the W30's cold air induction system, which used functional hood scoops to force ambient air directly into the engine. This dropped intake temperatures and increased power output, especially at higher speeds. Combined with low-restriction exhaust manifolds and aggressive camshaft timing, the W30 made power that the factory never officially acknowledged. What made the 442 W30 particularly deadly was its chassis balance. Oldsmobile engineers understood that power meant nothing without control. So they developed a sophisticated suspension system that actually worked. The front suspension used heavy-duty springs and shocks, featured a specially tuned setup that minimized wheel hop during hard acceleration. The brakes were upgraded with front discs and rear drums that could actually slow the car down. The steering was precise by 60s standards. This was a muscle car that handled curves as well as straightaways. The performance numbers were devastating. 0 to 60 miles per hour took just 6.1 seconds, and the quarter mile disappeared in 14.3 seconds at 98 miles per hour. Those times put it among the quickest production cars of 1968, but the real deadliness came from its sleeper appearance. Unlike the flashy Dodge Chargers or aggressive Plymouth Roadrunners, the 442 looked sophisticated and understated. Opponents had no idea what they were facing until the Oldsmobile vanished in their rearview mirror. Only about 4,000 442 W30 cars were built in 1968, making them rare, even when new. Today, they're among the most sought-after Oldsmobile muscle cars, with collectors appreciating their combination of performance, sophistication, and relative rarity. The W30 proved that you didn't need cartoon styling or outrageous appearance to be deadly. Sometimes quiet confidence and genuine capability were more threatening than any amount of flash. Number 14, the 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle SS396. General Motors played the displacement game better than anyone, and the 1969 Chevelle SS with the 396 cubic inches big block represented their sweet spot of power, affordability, and availability. This wasn't the most powerful engine in the Chevelle lineup. That honor belonged to the 427, but the 396 L34 motor offered the perfect balance of performance and streetability that made it genuinely dangerous in everyday driving. The L34 engine produced 350 horsepower and 385 pound-feet of torque, conservative numbers that didn't tell the whole story. This was a torque monster that pulled hard from idle to redline, making it brutally effective at stoplight wars and highway passing maneuvers. The engine breathed through a single 4-barrel carburetor and featured hydraulic lifters, making it reliable and easy to maintain. Unlike the exotic COPO or L72 engines that required constant attention, the 396 just worked. The 1969 Chevelle body was one of the most beautiful designs ever to emerge from Detroit. The long hood and short deck proportions were perfect, and the SS package added just enough aggressive styling to communicate intent without crossing into cartoonish territory. Inside, the driver faced simple gauges and straightforward controls. This was a tool designed for a specific purpose, and everything unnecessary had been eliminated. The result was a pure driving experience that connected driver and machine in ways modern cars can only dream about. What made the 396 Chevelle particularly deadly was its accessibility. Unlike limited production specials or expensive options, this was an engine available to anyone who checked the right box on the order form. Tens of thousands were built, meaning these cars flooded streets and drag strips across America. Young drivers with minimal experience suddenly had 400 pound-feet of torque and rear tires that couldn't handle the load. The results were predictable: spinning, sliding, and more than a few wrapped-around telephone poles. The car could run mid-14-second quarter miles bone stock, and simple modifications dropped times into the 13s. The aftermarket supported these Chevelles extensively, and within months of taking delivery, most owners had already added headers, intake manifolds, and gears. The 396 engine responded beautifully to modifications, with headwork and camshaft upgrades pushing power well over 400 horses. This tunability made the Chevelle deadly, not just from the factory, but increasingly dangerous as owners learned to extract more performance. Today, 1969 Chevelle SS 396 cars are among the most collectible muscle cars ever built. Clean original examples command premium prices, while modified versions still dominate vintage drag racing events. They represent the golden mean of muscle car philosophy: enough power to thrill, enough reliability to drive daily, enough style to turn heads, and enough affordability that regular people could actually own one. That combination made them deadly then and legendary now. Number 13, the 1966 Dodge Charger with 426 Hemi. When Dodge created the original Charger for 1966, they built something that looked like it had been designed for a science fiction movie. The fastback roofline, hidden headlights, and full-width taillights were radical departures from conservative American styling. But beneath that Buck Rogers exterior beat the heart of a pure predator. The 426 cubic inch Hemi V8, the most feared engine in American automotive history. The Hemi name came from its hemispherical combustion chambers, which allowed for larger valves and better breathing than conventional wedge head designs. The 1966 Street Hemi produced a factory-rated 425 horsepower, but everyone knew that was a lie told to keep insurance companies and safety regulators somewhat appeased. Real-world dyno testing suggested closer to 500 horsepower at the crank, and the torque output was simply brutal. This was a race engine that happened to be street legal, temperamental, and violent, and absolutely glorious. The 1966 Charger's deadliness came from the mismatch between its capabilities and the era's safety standards. This was a car that could hit 60 miles per hour in the low 6-second range and run quarter miles in the low 14, but it rode on bias ply tires with terrifying grip characteristics, had drum brakes that heated up quickly, and featured steering that required genuine upper body strength. The Hemi made so much power that the rear tires simply couldn't transfer it to the pavement without smoking. Drivers learned to modulate the throttle carefully because mashing it meant spinning helplessly. Inside, the Charger featured a unique interior with 4 individual bucket seats and a full-length console. The dashboard was a sweeping affair with electroluminescent gauges that looked appropriately futuristic, but all that styling was secondary to the experience of driving a Hemi. The engine's loping idle shook the entire car. The solid lifters required frequent adjustment. The dual 4-barrel carburetors needed constant tuning. This was not a car for casual owners. This was a machine that demanded commitment, skill, and respect. Only about 468 1966 Chargers were built with the Hemi engine, making them extraordinarily rare even when new. Most buyers opted for more tractable engines like the 383 or 440 cubic inch big blocks, which offered impressive performance without the Hemi's demanding personality. Those few who ordered the Hemi got bragging rights and straight-line performance that embarrassed nearly everything else on the road. But they also got a car that could kill them if they made mistakes. Today, 1966 Hemi Chargers are among the most valuable muscle cars in existence, with 6-figure price tags and still climbing. They represent the pure, unfiltered muscle car experience. Excessive power, challenging dynamics, and style that still looks radical nearly 60 years later. They were deadly because they gave ordinary people access to extraordinary performance without the safety systems or engineering sophistication necessary to handle it safely. That's exactly what made them glorious. Number 12, the 1967 Plymouth GTX. Plymouth's entry into the muscle car wars came with the 1967 GTX, and they didn't hold back. This was positioned as the gentleman's muscle car, offering luxury appointments alongside serious performance. But don't let the upscale marketing fool you. With either the 440 cubic inch Super Commando or the optional 426 Hemi under the hood, the GTX was as deadly as anything wearing a Plymouth badge. The standard engine was the 440 cubic inch V8, producing 375 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque. That Super Commando motor was a torque monster that made the GTX devastating in real-world driving situations. Unlike the high-strung Hemi that needed high RPM to make peak power, the 440 pulled hard from just above idle. This made it perfect for street racing, where most confrontations happened from rolling starts or stoplight launches. The massive torque meant instant acceleration, and the robust bottom end meant reliability that the Hemi couldn't match. For those who wanted ultimate bragging rights, the 426 Hemi option delivered. Plymouth installed the same legendary engine that powered their drag racing efforts, complete with dual 4-barrel carburetors, heavy-duty internals, and that characteristic lumpy idle that announced your presence from blocks away. The Hemi GTX could run 13-second quarter miles with a skilled driver, making it one of the quickest production cars of 1967. The performance came at a cost. The Hemi option nearly doubled the base price, and the engine's temperamental nature meant constant maintenance. What separated the GTX from cheaper Plymouth muscle cars like the upcoming Roadrunner was its standard equipment level. Every GTX came with bucket seats, console shifter, heavy-duty suspension, and upgraded brakes. The interior featured high-quality materials and thoughtful design. Plymouth was targeting slightly older buyers with more money and less tolerance for stripped-down basic transportation. The GTX offered a way to go genuinely fast while still enjoying comfort and refinement. The styling was aggressive, but not cartoonish. The long hood and short deck proportions communicated performance intent, while the simple grille and restrained trim kept things tasteful. Twin hood scoops were functional, feeding cool air to the engine. The result was a car that looked fast, standing still, but didn't scream for attention like some competitors. This sleeper aspect made the GTX particularly deadly. Opponents often underestimated it, until they found themselves staring at taillights. Plymouth built over 30,000 GTX models in 1967, but only a small fraction had the Hemi option. Today, those Hemi cars are extremely valuable, while 440 GTX models remain relatively affordable for entry into legitimate muscle car ownership. The GTX proved that muscle car could offer both performance and luxury, that you didn't have to sacrifice comfort for speed. That combination made it deadly in a different way. It gave drivers the confidence to push harder, to go faster, because the car felt so composed and capable even at illegal speeds. Number 11, the 1969 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 2. Mercury didn't have the muscle car heritage of Chevrolet or Pontiac, but when they decided to go racing in NASCAR, they built something genuinely special. The 1969 Cyclone Spoiler 2 was a homologation special designed to qualify for stock car racing, and the street version carried over enough of the racing DNA to make it surprisingly deadly. This was Mercury's most serious performance offering of the decade, and it combined NASCAR-proven aerodynamics with serious engine options. The Cyclone Spoiler 2 featured a unique front end with a massive wing and spoiler designed to reduce drag and increase downforce at high speeds. The aerodynamic modifications actually worked, providing measurable improvements to straight-line stability above 70 miles per hour. Under that race-inspired bodywork sat either the 390 cubic inch V8, producing 270 horsepower, or the seriously powerful 428 cubic inch Cobra jet, making 335 horsepower. The Cobra jet option transformed the Cyclone from interesting to deadly. That 428 displaced 428 cubic inches and featured ram air induction, high flow heads, and aggressive camshaft timing. Factory horsepower ratings were conservative. Real-world output was closer to 400 horses. Combined with the Cyclone's relatively light curb weight, around 3,800 pounds, this created devastating acceleration. 0 to 60 happened in the low 6-second range, and quarter miles disappeared in the mid-13s. What made the Cyclone Spoiler 2 particularly interesting was its rarity. Mercury built only around 500 examples to meet NASCAR homologation requirements, meaning you almost never saw these cars on the street. Most buyers didn't even know Mercury made a serious muscle car, giving Cyclone owners the ultimate sleeper advantage. Pulling up next to a Plymouth Roadrunner or Chevelle SS in a Mercury sedan meant instant underestimation, which made victories even sweeter. The interior was pure Lincoln Mercury luxury, with comfortable seats, quality materials, and thoughtful ergonomics. This wasn't a stripped-down race car with minimal amenities. This was a gentleman's hot rod that could embarrass dedicated muscle cars while offering genuine comfort. The suspension was tuned for high-speed stability rather than drag strip launches, reflecting the car's NASCAR heritage. On back roads and highways, the Cyclone felt more planted and composed than most competitors. Today, Cyclone Spoiler 2 models are among the most collectible Mercuries ever built, with Cobra jet examples commanding serious money. They represent what happens when a luxury brand decides to go racing and transfers that technology to the street. The deadliness came from their unexpected capability. Nobody expected the Mercury to be this quick, this capable, or this much fun to drive. That surprise factor made them dangerous on the street and successful at the strip. Number 10. The 1968 Dodge Dart GTS with 440. Sometimes the deadliest package comes in the smallest box. The 1968 Dodge Dart GTS took Chrysler's compact platform and stuffed it full of big block fury, creating something genuinely terrifying. This was automotive homicide on radial tires. A car so powerful relative to its size that it required serious driver skill just to keep pointed in the right direction. The combination of lightweight and massive displacement created one of the highest power-to-weight ratios available in any production car. The Dart GTS came standard with the 383 cubic inch small block, which was adequately quick but not particularly special. The magic happened when you checked the box for the 440 cubic inch big block option. Suddenly, this innocent-looking compact car became a street fighter capable of humiliating much more expensive machinery. The 440 produced 375 horsepower and 480 pound-feet of torque, numbers that seemed impossible in a car weighing just over 3,000 pounds. The performance was absolutely brutal. 0 to 60 happened in under 6 seconds, and quarter-mile times in the high 13s were achievable with minimal driver skill. But the Dart's deadliness came from its handling characteristics, or lack thereof. The big block engine overwhelmed the front suspension, creating heavy understeer in corners. The rear suspension struggled with the massive torque, leading to wheel hop and unpredictable breakaway. The brakes were barely adequate for the car's straight-line performance. This was a car that could get you into trouble faster than you could react. Inside, the Dart GTS was simple and functional. The dashboard featured basic gauges and straightforward controls. The seats were comfortable, but offered minimal lateral support. The whole interior was clearly designed for a different mission than the engine suggested. There was a massive disconnect between the civilized cabin and the violent performance, which made the car even more dangerous. Drivers could feel comfortable and confident right up until they mashed the throttle and discovered just how much car they were really handling. The 440 Dart GTS became a legend at drag strips across America. The lightweight meant fantastic acceleration, and the solid rear axle put power down effectively in a straight line. Simple modifications like headers, intake work, and gearing could drop times into the 13s or even high 12s. More serious builds with headwork and camshaft upgrades created genuine race cars that terrorized superstock classes throughout the late 60s and into the 70s. Dodge built relatively few Dart GTS models with the 440 option, making them rare and collectible today. Clean examples command strong money, especially cars with documentation and original components. They represent the pure hot rod philosophy. Take something small and light, install an engine far too powerful for the application, and let physics handle the rest. That recipe created deadly performance and unforgettable driving experiences that still resonate with enthusiasts over 50 years later. Number 9. The 1967 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. Chevrolet's answer to the Ford Mustang arrived in 1967, and while the base Camaro was attractive and capable, the Z28 package transformed it into a genuine track weapon. This wasn't a drag strip special. This was a car designed to dominate the sports car club of America's Trans Am racing series. But those racing intentions translated into a street car that was deadly in the hands of anyone willing to push its limits. The Z28 featured a specially prepared 302 cubic inch small block V8, producing an advertised 290 horsepower. That rating was conservative, with real-world output closer to 350 horses. The engine featured a solid lifter camshaft, high-compression pistons, 4-bolt main bearing caps, and a Holley 4-barrel carburetor. This was a race motor with minimal concessions to street manners. It idled roughly, ran hot in traffic, and demanded high-octane fuel. In return, it delivered screaming performance that rewarded high RPM driving. What made the Z28 deadly was its balanced approach to performance. Unlike drag strip specials that only went straight quickly, the Z28 could corner. The suspension featured heavy-duty springs and shocks, front and rear sway bars, and quick ratio steering. The brakes were upgraded with front discs and rear drums that actually worked. The result was a car that could attack winding roads with genuine capability, something most muscle cars couldn't do. The performance numbers were impressive for a small block car. 0 to 60 happened in the low 6-second range, and quarter miles clicked off in the low 14. But the Z28's real strength was on road courses, where its balanced handling and strong brakes allowed it to carry higher speeds through corners than heavier, more powerful competitors. On tracks like Laguna Seca and Riverside, Z28s competed against and often beat exotic European sports cars. Chevrolet built just over 600 Z28 Camaros in 1967, making them rare from the start. The package wasn't cheap, and the car's uncompromising nature meant it appealed to serious drivers rather than casual enthusiasts. Most Z28s saw hard use on tracks and streets, meaning survivors are extremely rare today. Clean, documented examples command six-figure prices, reflecting their historical importance and genuine capability. The 1967 Camaro Z28 proved that American manufacturers could build cars that handled as well as they accelerated. It was deadly, not just in straight lines, but everywhere. A complete performance package that challenged assumptions about what American cars could do. That versatility made it dangerous. Owners could attack any road or track with confidence, pushing limits that lesser cars couldn't approach. Today, it remains one of the most respected first-generation Camaros. A true driver's car from an era when that phrase actually meant something. Number 8, the 1969 Plymouth Roadrunner with 440 six-pack. Plymouth's budget muscle car became an instant legend, and the 1969 model year brought the ultimate street version, the 440 cubic inch six-pack option. This engine featured 3 two-barrel Holley carburetors arranged on an aluminum intake manifold, creating one of the most distinctive engine bays of the muscle car era. More importantly, it created one of the deadliest street cars ever to wear Plymouth badges. The six-pack engine produced a factory-rated 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. But those numbers told only part of the story. The triple carburetor setup meant incredible throttle response and power delivery across the entire RPM range. The center carburetor handled normal driving, while the outboard carburetors opened under heavy throttle, unleashing massive power. The result was an engine that could put around town civilly, but transformed into a monster the moment you pushed past half throttle. What made the six-pack Roadrunner particularly deadly was its appearance, or lack thereof. Plymouth's philosophy was maximum performance at minimum cost, which meant the Roadrunner came standard with rubber floor mats, basic bench seats, and minimal sound deadening. The exterior looked almost plain, with simple graphics and basic trim. This sleeper appearance meant opponents often underestimated what they were facing. That Roadrunner that looked like your grandma's grocery getter could run low 13-second quarter miles and hit 60 in the low 5-second range. The handling was typical muscle car fare, great in straight lines, terrifying in corners. The front heavy weight distribution and limited suspension sophistication meant the Roadrunner pushed hard in turns and required respect on wet pavement. The brakes were barely adequate for the car's performance, with front drums that faded quickly under hard use. This was a car designed for one mission: getting to the next stoplight faster than anything else on the road. It accomplished that mission brilliantly. Plymouth priced the Roadrunner aggressively, making serious performance accessible to young buyers. The base car with the 383 engine cost under $3,000, while even a loaded six-pack version stayed under $4,000. This pricing strategy put deadly performance into the hands of inexperienced drivers, leading to predictable results. Insurance companies quickly learned to fear the Roadrunner, raising rates dramatically for young male drivers. The car's combination of power, low price, and cartoon graphics made it a cultural phenomenon. Today, six-pack Roadrunners are among the most collectible Plymouth muscle cars. Clean examples command premium prices, especially cars with rare options like the 4-speed manual transmission or A12 hood with functional air grabber. They represent pure muscle car philosophy: maximum power, minimum frills, and absolutely no apologies. That combination made them deadly on the street and legendary in automotive history. Number 7. The 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. When Ford decided to go racing in NASCAR and Trans Am, they needed to homologate special engines for street use. The result was the Boss 429, one of the most exotic and deadly engines ever installed in a production Mustang. This wasn't a simple big block. This was a race motor with minimal concessions to street legality, and it transformed the Mustang into something genuinely terrifying. The 429 cubic inch semi-Hemi engine featured canted valve heads similar to Chrysler's legendary Hemi design. This allowed for better breathing and higher RPM capability than conventional wedge head engines. Ford rated the Boss 429 at 375 horsepower, but real-world dyno tests suggested closer to 500 horsepower at the crank. The engine featured solid lifters, enormous valves, and NASCAR-level internal components. This was absolutely a race motor that happened to be street legal. The performance was savage. 0 to 60 happened in around 5.5 seconds, and quarter-mile times in the high 13s were achievable with a skilled driver. But the Boss 429's deadliness came from its power delivery. This engine made huge torque from low RPM and pulled hard all the way to redline. The combination of race-level components and massive displacement created an engine that could break traction at almost any speed, making the Mustang a genuine handful for inexperienced drivers. Ford installed the Boss 429 in the sports roof body style, giving it aggressive styling with a fastback roofline and functional hood scoop. The suspension featured heavy-duty components capable of handling the engine's power, but by modern standards, the handling was primitive. The Mustang would understeer in corners and could snap into oversteer if you lifted throttle mid-turn. The brakes were upgraded but still struggled to handle the car's performance. This was a car that demanded respect and skill. Only around 858 Boss 429 Mustangs were built for 1969, making them extraordinarily rare. Most were purchased by serious enthusiasts who understood what they were buying. This wasn't a cruiser or daily driver. This was a race car with license plates. Many Boss 429 Mustangs saw competition use in drag racing or road racing, meaning unmolested survivors are incredibly rare today. Clean examples command prices well into six figures. The Boss 429 proved that American manufacturers could build exotic, high-performance engines that competed with anything from Europe. It was deadly because it offered race car performance in street car packaging, giving ordinary people access to extraordinary capability. The engine's legendary status has only grown over the decades, and today it's considered one of the greatest American V8 engines ever produced. The 1969 Boss 429 Mustang represents the absolute peak of 60s muscle car engineering. Number 6. The 1967 Chevrolet Corvette L88. The Corvette had always been America's sports car, but the 1967 model year brought something truly special: the L88 big block option. This was Chevrolet's most powerful production engine, a 427 cubic inch monster that produced a factory-rated 430 horsepower. But everyone knew that rating was conservative, with real-world output closer to 500 horses. This was a race engine, barely civilized for street use. The L88 featured aluminum cylinder heads, a radical solid lifter camshaft, huge valves, and breathing capabilities that embarrassed most dedicated race motors. The compression ratio was 11:1, requiring premium fuel and careful tuning. The engine idled roughly and ran hot in traffic, making it unsuitable for casual driving. But when you open the throttle, the L88 delivered performance that few production cars could match. This was unfiltered, uncompromising American V8 power. The 1967 Corvette's styling was stunning, representing the pinnacle of the second-generation C2 body. The long hood and short deck proportions were perfect, and the available side-exit exhaust created an auditory experience that still raises hairs on necks today. Inside, the Corvette offered genuine sports car ergonomics with proper gauges, supportive seats, and controls positioned for serious driving. This was a real sports car that happened to have muscle car power. Performance was devastating. 0 to 60 happened in around 5.5 seconds, and quarter-mile times in the low 13s were achievable. But the L88 Corvette's deadliness came from its top speed capability. Properly geared examples could exceed 140 miles per hour, making them among the fastest production cars available anywhere. That speed potential, combined with 1960s tire technology and brake capability, created a genuinely dangerous machine. Chevrolet built only about 220 L88 Corvettes in 1967, making them extraordinarily rare. The option cost serious money, nearly doubling the base Corvette's price. Most buyers were serious enthusiasts who raced their cars, meaning survival rate has been low. Today, 88 Corvettes command prices approaching or exceeding $500,000 for pristine examples. They represent the ultimate expression of 60s Corvette performance. The L88 proved that American manufacturers could build engines matching or exceeding anything from Europe in terms of specific output and performance. It was deadly because it gave drivers access to race car performance without requiring race car skills. The combination of massive power, relatively primitive safety systems, and challenging handling characteristics meant the L88 required genuine driving ability. Those who mastered it found one of the most rewarding performance cars of the decade. Those who didn't often found themselves in serious trouble. Number 5, the 1968 Plymouth Barracuda Formula S with 383. Plymouth's pony car competitor to the Mustang and Camaro came into its own in 1968 with dramatically restyled bodywork and serious engine options. The Formula S package with the 383 cubic inch V8 created one of the most underrated muscle cars of the 60s. This was a small, light car with genuine big block power, creating a combination that was genuinely deadly in the hands of inexperienced drivers. The 383 engine came in multiple states of tune, but the hot setup produced 335 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque. In the Barracuda's 3,200-pound body, this created acceleration that embarrassed much more expensive machinery. 0 to 60 happened in the mid-5-second range, and quarter-mile times in the low 14s were standard. What made these numbers particularly impressive was the Barracuda's compact dimensions. This wasn't a full-sized muscle car. This was a nimble predator. The styling was aggressive and distinctive, with a long hood, fastback roofline, and Plymouth's signature split grille. Inside, the Barracuda offered surprisingly good packaging, with usable rear seats and decent trunk space. But the Formula S package transformed it from practical transportation into a genuine performance machine. The suspension was upgraded with heavy-duty components, the brakes were improved, and the interior got proper gauges and supportive seats. What made the 383 Barracuda particularly deadly was its handling. The relatively lightweight and good weight distribution meant it could change direction quickly, something most muscle cars struggled to do. The shorter wheelbase made it feel nimble and responsive, but also meant it could get twitchy at high speeds. The big block's weight up front created understeer in tight corners, and the rear end could snap around if you lifted throttle mid-turn. This was a car that rewarded skilled drivers and punished mistakes. Plymouth built relatively few 383 Barracudas compared to small block versions, making them rare and collectible today. The car lived in the shadow of more famous muscle cars like the Roadrunner and GTX, which meant it never got the recognition it deserved when new. Today, enthusiasts appreciate the Barracuda's unique combination of compact dimensions, big block power, and distinctive styling. Clean Formula S examples with the 383 command strong money, especially cars with documentation and rare options. The 383 Barracuda proved that you didn't need a full-size platform to deliver deadly. Number 4, the 1969 Ford Torino Talladega. Ford wasn't playing games when they built the Talladega. This was war, pure NASCAR warfare against Dodge and Plymouth on the high banks. The 1969 Torino Talladega wore an extended nose that stretched 5 inches longer than standard flush-mounted grille, and a sloped front end designed by wind tunnel engineers who cared about winning races, not keeping amateur drivers alive. Under that elongated snout sat the 428 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8, officially rated at 335 horsepower, but realistically pushing 400. What made the Talladega particularly lethal was its split personality. At normal speeds, it drove like the family sedan it was based on, soft, wallowy, and disconnected, but pushed past 80 miles per hour, and the aerodynamic nose started working, creating false confidence that led drivers to explore velocities their skills couldn't match. The brakes were inadequate drum units, laughable at 120 miles per hour, The suspension was NASCAR-inspired but street-compromised. Too stiff for comfort, but not stiff enough for genuine control. Only 754 Talladega models were built to satisfy NASCAR homologation requirements. The aerodynamics worked brilliantly in straight lines at sustained high speeds, but introduce a corner or emergency maneuver, and that long nose and rear-biased weight would send you spinning before you knew what happened. The Talladega could hit 60 in 6.5 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-14s, but those numbers told only half the story. This was a race car designed to turn left at 200 miles per hour, forced into service on public roads where people drove in all directions. Beautiful, purposeful, and absolutely deadly. Number 3, the 1969 Plymouth GTX 440 with Track Pack. Plymouth's GTX was supposed to be the gentleman's muscle car, the sophisticated choice for buyers who wanted performance with class. Then, Plymouth offered the Track Pack option on 440-equipped models, and sophistication went straight out the window. The Track Pack wasn't cosmetic. It was a complete performance overhaul that transformed the already potent GTX into something genuinely frightening. That 440 cubic inch wedge motor, equipped with Track Pack, received a hotter camshaft, better breathing, higher compression, and tuning that pushed output well over 400 horses. Plymouth was deliberately vague because insurance companies were watching. The Track Pack included sure grip differential with 410 gears, meaning savage acceleration coupled with stratospheric top speed. The transmission options were beefed up 4-speed manual or bulletproof torque flight automatic, both capable of handling abuse, but neither preventing catastrophic driver mistakes. What truly made the Track Pack GTX deadly was the mismatch between acceleration and braking. This car hit 60 in 5.5 seconds and cleared the quarter mile in high 13s at over 100 miles per hour. Getting to those speeds was effortless. Stopping was prayer and panic as front disc brakes and rear drums would heat up, fade, and leave you with a pedal that felt more like suggestion than command. The GTX weighed nearly 3,800 pounds, and all that mass didn't want to slow down. The handling was equally treacherous. The car would understeer initially, then snap into violent oversteer when rear tires broke loose. Throttle application in corners required precision because too much enthusiasm sent the tail sliding with suddenness that caught even experienced drivers off guard. Plymouth built fewer than 2,000 GTX models with Track Pack, making them rare, valuable, and genuinely dangerous. Number 2, the 1969 Dodge Charger 500 with Hemi. When Dodge created the Charger 500, they were chasing NASCAR glory. The street version was homologation necessity, but that didn't make it less lethal. The 1969 Charger 500 wore flush grille, removed unnecessary trim, and featured modified roofline to improve aerodynamics. But the real story was that 26 cubic inch Hemi sitting under the hood like a caged animal. The Hemi was rated at 425 horsepower, pure fiction designed to appease insurance actuaries. Real-world output was closer to 500 horses, maybe more. The Hemi had personality unlike any other engine. Docile below 3,000 RPM, then absolutely explosive above it. This on-off characteristic made smooth throttle application nearly impossible, especially in low traction situations. What made the Charger 500 particularly deadly was combining that violent Hemi in a car weighing over 3,900 pounds. The weight made it stable in straight-line acceleration, but created tremendous momentum that fought every directional change. The steering was slow, requiring multiple turns lock to lock, meaning emergency maneuvers happened in slow motion while your brain screamed. The brakes were front discs and rear drums, marginally adequate for normal driving but woefully insufficient for managing achievable speeds. The Charger 500 could hit 60 in low 5s and demolish the quarter mile in high 12s at over 115 miles per hour. Those were supercar numbers in 1969, achieved by a car costing less than $5,000. No special license required, no training period, no physics understanding necessary. Just sign papers and try not to die. Dodge built only around 500 Hemi-powered aerodynamic warriors, making them instantly legendary and spectacularly dangerous. The combination of Hemi power, heavy weight, marginal brakes, and aerodynamics designed for oval racing created perfect storm of lethality. Number 1, the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. At the absolute pinnacle of 60s muscle car madness sat something that wasn't supposed to exist: the 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1. This was Chevrolet's dirty little secret, an aluminum block, big block monster never advertised, never promoted, sold only to buyers who knew the secret handshake. Under that cowl induction hood sat the all-aluminum 427 cubic inch ZL1 engine, so exotic and powerful that Chevrolet barely acknowledged its existence. The official rating was 430 horsepower, a joke. Real output was north of 550 horses, maybe touching 600 with proper tuning. The aluminum block saved over 100 pounds compared to iron, improving weight distribution and making the Camaro's nose lighter and more responsive. The ZL1 could run quarter miles in low 12s at over 115 miles per hour, numbers genuinely shocking for a street car. Only 69 ZL1 Camaros were ever built, making them rarer than nearly any other muscle car. Each cost over $7,500. Enormous money in 1969. Buyers weren't getting luxury. They were getting purpose-built race cars that happened to be street legal. The ZL1 required high-octane racing fuel, frequent maintenance, and skilled drivers who understood this engine had no interest in compromise. What made the ZL1 the deadliest was simple. It represented the absolute limit of contemporary technology. This wasn't about comfort or daily drivability. It was pure, unfiltered speed, delivered with savagery that scared even experienced drivers. Throttle response was instant and violent. The torque curve was relentless. And unlike muscle cars, fast only in straight lines, the ZL1's improved weight distribution made it competent in corners, meaning you could get into trouble faster with more confidence. The Camaro ZL1 wasn't just the deadliest muscle car of the 60s. It was the car that defined what deadly meant. If the 1960s were deadly, the 1970s took it even further. These next 16 cars proved that safety was an afterthought. The 1970s were supposed to be the funeral, the final chapter, the decade that killed the American muscle car and buried it under a mountain of emissions regulations, insurance premiums, and fuel economy standards. But before the lights went out completely, there was one last explosion of power. One final burst of fury that proved horsepower wasn't ready to die quietly. The early 70s produced some of the most dangerous, most powerful, and most unhinged machines ever to wear American badges. These weren't the refined performance cars of today. They were raw, violent, and willing to kill you if you made a mistake. Today, we're counting down 16 deadliest 70s muscle cars ever made. The last warriors of a dying era that refused to surrender without a fight. Number 16, the 1970 AMC Rebel Machine. American Motors didn't have the budget of the big three, but they had something more valuable: the willingness to build something absolutely insane to get attention. The Rebel Machine was AMC's middle finger to anyone who thought they couldn't compete in the muscle car wars. It came dressed in red, white, and blue paint with a massive hood scoop that looked like it belonged on a dragster, not a mid-sized sedan. Under that ridiculous scoop sat AMC's 390 cubic inch V8, which made 340 horsepower and 430 pound-feet of torque. That might not sound like much compared to the big block monsters from Chrysler and GM, but the machine weighed under 3,500 pounds, which gave it a power-to-weight ratio that made it genuinely quick. The quarter mile came in around 14.5 seconds at over 95 miles per hour, which was respectable for the era. But what made the machine deadly wasn't just the power, it was the handling, or lack thereof. AMC's suspension tuning was primitive compared to the competition. The steering was vague and slow. The brakes were marginal at best. And the chassis was built for comfort, not performance. The result was a car that could accelerate hard in a straight line, but became genuinely frightening when asked to do anything else. Turn into a corner with any enthusiasm, and the front end would plow straight ahead, ignoring your steering inputs. Lift off the throttle mid-corner, and the rear end would step out violently as weight transferred forward. The machine also suffered from terrible weight distribution, with the heavy V8 sitting far forward in the chassis. That made the car nose-heavy and prone to understeer. But punch the throttle, and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose, and you'd be fighting to keep the car pointed in the right direction. Only about 2,000 machines were built, which made them rare, even when new. Today, they're collector's items. But back in 1970, they were just cheap muscle cars that could surprise unwary drivers with their willingness to bite. Number 15, the 1971 Mercury Cyclone spoiler, 429. Mercury's muscle car offerings were often overlooked next to their Ford cousins, but the Cyclone spoiler was a serious performance machine. The 429 cubic inch Cobra Jet V8 made 370 horsepower officially, but like all Ford big blocks of the era, that number was conservative. Real output was closer to 420 horses, with torque numbers that exceeded 450 pound-feet. The Cyclone could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds. Those were impressive numbers, but they came with consequences. The Cyclone was heavy, nearly 3,900 pounds, which meant it had serious momentum once it got moving. Changing direction required planning and commitment, because the steering was slow and the suspension was tuned more for high-speed stability than cornering agility. The car was built for NASCAR homologation, which meant the aerodynamics were optimized for oval track racing, not drag strips or canyon roads. The long hood and short deck proportions meant forward visibility was compromised, especially when the front end lifted under hard acceleration, and the brakes were barely adequate for normal driving, let alone for repeatedly hauling this beast down from triple-digit speeds. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant problem during hard launches. Get on the power too aggressively, and the rear end would skip and bounce, breaking traction and sending the car sideways. The Cyclone demanded respect and smooth inputs. Treat it gently, and it would reward you with effortless power and comfortable cruising. Provoke it, and it would remind you that this was a car from an era when safety was optional and survival depended on skill. Number 14, the 1970 Oldsmobile 442 W30. Oldsmobile had been building performance cars since the early 60s, and by 1970 they'd refined the formula to near perfection. The 442 W30 package combined the 455 cubic inch V8 with upgraded suspension, functional hood scoops, and enough torque to light up the rear tires from a standstill. The engine made 365 horsepower officially, but that torque figure, 395 pound-feet, was what made the W30 dangerous. The power delivery was smooth and linear until you buried the throttle. Then, it transformed into something violent, with a surge of acceleration that could catch even experienced drivers off guard. The quarter mile came in around 13.5 seconds, at over 100 miles per hour. But the W30's real danger came from its refinement. It didn't feel like a wild muscle car. The interior was plush, the ride was comfortable, and the engine was smooth at cruising speeds. That civilized demeanor could lull you into a false sense of security. Then you'd put your foot down, the rear end would break loose, and you'd suddenly remember that this was still a car with nearly 400 pound-feet of torque and mediocre tires. The chassis was typical GMA body, competent, but not exceptional. The steering was slow and offered little feedback. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than handling, and the brakes were adequate at best. The W30 package added some stiffer springs and better shocks, but it couldn't overcome the basic limitations of a platform designed for cruising, not carving corners. What made it deadly was the disconnect between how it felt and what it could do. Most muscle cars announced their intentions with rough idles and stiff suspensions. The W30 felt like a luxury car right up until you asked for full power. Then it reminded you that sophistication and safety weren't the same thing. Number 13, the 1970 Plymouth GTX 440+6. Plymouth's GTX had been around since the late 60s, but the 1970 version with the 440+6 engine represented the peak of B-body muscle. The name came from the 3 two-barrel carburetors that sat atop 490 cubic inches of Mopar Fury. The engine made 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to propel the 3,700-pound GTX through the quarter mile in the mid-13s. But the real story was the power delivery. Those three carburetors created a progressive throttle response. Docile at part throttle when only the center carburetor was working. Violent at full throttle when all three kicked in. That transition could be abrupt and unpredictable. You'd be cruising along peacefully, then roll into the throttle mid-corner, and suddenly the outboard carburetors would open and you'd have way more power than traction. The rear end would step out, the car would rotate, and you'd be fighting to keep it pointed straight. The GTX's size and weight made it stable at high speeds, but difficult to maneuver in tight situations. The steering was slow, nearly 5 turns lock to lock, which meant you had to anticipate corners and turn in early. Wait too long, and you'd understeer straight into whatever was on the outside of the turn. The brakes were better than some muscle cars of the era, especially with the optional front discs, but they still struggled with fade during hard use. The suspension used Chrysler's torsion bar front end, which was more sophisticated than coil springs, but still couldn't overcome the basic physics of a nose-heavy rear-drive car with marginal tires. The GTX was a gentleman's muscle car, refined, comfortable, and capable of genuine violence when provoked. It proved that you could build a car that was both civilized and dangerous, a machine that would cruise comfortably all day and then terrify you the moment you asked for full power. Number 12, the 1971 Pontiac GTO Judge 455 HO. The Judge had been Pontiac's wildest GTO since 1969, and the 1971 version with the 455 HO engine was the final, furious expression of that philosophy. The styling was deliberately outrageous. Bright colors, bold graphics, and a massive rear wing that looked like it belonged on a race car. But that aggressive appearance couldn't hide the fact that the chassis was struggling to contain all that power. The 455 cubic inch V8 made 335 horsepower by the new SAE net ratings, which measured power with all accessories and exhaust restrictions in place. But the real output was significantly higher, closer to 400 horses by the old gross rating system. More importantly, the torque was massive, 480 pound-feet, that arrived low in the rev range and stayed strong all the way to redline. The Judge could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in around 6 seconds, but it weighed over 3,700 pounds, which meant it had momentum that simply couldn't be denied. Once this car got moving, it wanted to keep moving in a straight line. The steering was slow and vague, typical of Pontiac's A-body platform, and the suspension was soft enough that body roll was dramatic in any kind of spirited driving. The brakes were marginal, especially for a car this heavy and this fast. Fade set in quickly during hard use, and stopping distances grew longer, just when you needed them to be shorter. What made the Judge dangerous was the disconnect between its appearance and its actual capabilities. It looked like a race car, which made drivers believe it could handle like one. But the reality was far different. This was a straight-line brute that could get loose in a hurry if you pushed it in the corners. The rear suspension would hop and skip under hard acceleration, and the rear end could step out violently if you got on the power too early coming out of a turn. Number 11, the 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS S454 LS6. This was the pinnacle, the absolute peak of Chevrolet muscle before everything came crashing down. The Chevelle SS with the LS654 cubic inch V8 was rated at 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, but everyone knew those numbers were lies. Conservative estimates put the real output closer to 500 horses, and dyno tests proved it. This engine was so powerful that Chevy only offered it for 1 year because it was too much, too brutal, too dangerous. The LS6 could propel the Chevelle from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds and through the quarter mile in the high 13s. Those were numbers that would still be respectable today, and this was 1970. But all that power came without any of the safety nets we take for granted now. No traction control, no stability management, no anti-lock brakes, just you, a steering wheel, and 500 horsepower trying to kill you. The Chevelle's chassis was competent for the era, but it wasn't designed for this kind of abuse. The rear suspension would squat under hard acceleration, loading the rear tires until they finally gave up and turned into smoke machines. The front end would lift, making steering light and vague right when you needed precision most, and the brakes even with the optional front discs, were marginal at best for a car that could reach speeds where mistakes became catastrophic. What made the LS6 Chevelle truly dangerous was its accessibility. It looked like any other Chevelle on the road, which meant people underestimated it constantly. And that led to a lot of street races that ended badly, a lot of show-offs that ended in ditches, and a lot of legends about the car that was too powerful to survive. The LS6 engine featured forged internals, forged steel crankshaft, forged connecting rods, and forged aluminum pistons that could handle the stress of sustained, high RPM operation. The cylinder heads flowed massive amounts of air, and the camshaft profile was aggressive enough to make the engine idle rough and create significant overlap. The solid lifter valve train required regular adjustment, and the high compression ratio, 11.25 to 1, demanded premium fuel. This wasn't an engine you could neglect. It required maintenance, attention, and respect. Number 10. The 1970 Buick GSX Stage 1. Buick wasn't known for building muscle cars, which made the GSX all the more shocking. This was Buick's declaration that they could build something just as brutal as anything from Pontiac, Oldsmobile, or Chevrolet. The GSX came in wild colors, Apollo white and Saturn yellow, with bold stripes and graphics that announced this wasn't your grandfather's Buick. Under the hood sat the 455 cubic inch Stage 1 V8, which officially made 360 horsepower and 510 pound-feet of torque. That torque number was staggering. It was more than the Hemi, more than the LS6, more than anything else on American roads in 1970. And you felt every single pound-foot of it. The GSX could rip through the quarter mile in the high 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. But it weighed over 3,700 pounds, which meant it had momentum that simply refused to be denied. The steering was slow and vague, typical of GM's body platform, and the brakes were marginal at best. The suspension was tuned more for comfort than performance, which meant body roll was dramatic in corners. But the real danger was that torque. Plant your foot and the GSX would squat on its rear suspension, load up those rear tires, and then launch forward with a violence that could catch even experienced drivers off guard. The rear end would step out under hard acceleration, and correcting it required quick hands and quicker thinking. The Stage 1 engine was built for low-end torque, which meant it pulled like a freight train from idle, but ran out of breath at higher RPM. The long stroke, 4.31 inches, created massive leverage on the crankshaft, which translated to that incredible torque output. But it also meant the engine couldn't rev as high as short-stroke competitors. Peak power came at 4,700 RPM, and the engine was done making power by 5,500. That narrow power band meant you had to shift carefully to keep the engine in its sweet spot. The automatic transmission was the only option, which meant you couldn't use a manual gearbox to control power delivery. The turbo hydromatic was strong enough to handle the torque, but it shifted slowly compared to modern automatics, and there was no manual control beyond holding gears with the shifter. Number 9. The 1974 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am Super Duty 455. By 1974, the muscle car era was supposed to be over, dead, buried under a mountain of emissions regulations and insurance premiums. But Pontiac had one last ace up their sleeve, the Super Duty 455. This was a 7.5-liter monster that officially made 290 horsepower. But those were the new SAE net ratings that measured power with all accessories attached and exhaust restrictions in place. The reality was far more violent. The Super Duty 455 was an honest-to-goodness race engine that Pontiac somehow convinced the EPA to let them sell to the public. It featured forged pistons, a high-lift cam, special heads with larger valves, and improved porting, and an attitude that said emissions regulations could go to hell. The intake manifold was a high-rise aluminum unit that improved top-end breathing. The exhaust manifolds were cast iron but designed to reduce back pressure, and the ignition system was upgraded to handle the stress of high-performance operation. Only around 1,000 were built, which made them instant legends. The Trans Am could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s, which was astonishing for a car built in the middle of the malaise era. But It was also astonishing how willing this car was to swap ends on you. The Super Duty's massive torque curve meant power was available everywhere, and that meant the rear tires were constantly on the edge of breaking loose. The chassis was the same as the standard Trans Am, which meant it wasn't really designed to handle this much thrust. The steering was slow, the suspension was soft, and the brakes were barely adequate. Get on the power mid-corner, and the rear end would step out so violently that only experienced drivers could catch it before the car was facing the wrong direction. The Super Duty Trans Am was Pontiac's middle finger to everyone who said performance was dead, and it was glorious and terrifying in equal measure. The engine required premium fuel at a time when the gas crisis made premium hard to find and expensive to buy. Run regular unleaded, and the engine would ping and knock like it was trying to tear itself apart. The solid lifter cam meant valve adjustments every few thousand miles, and the Rochester Quadrajet carburetor was finicky at best. Number 8. The 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda. The Hemi Cuda was the stuff of legend even when it was new. Plymouth took their already aggressive Barracuda platform and stuffed it full of the 426 cubic inch Hemi V8, an engine so powerful it required its own hood with a massive scoop just to clear the air cleaner. The Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, but those numbers were as conservative as a church sermon. Real-world output was closer to 500 horses, and everyone knew it. The Hemi Cuda could blast through the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 miles per hour in under 6 seconds. That was supercar territory in 1970, and Plymouth did it with an engine that was essentially a race motor, with turn signals bolted to it. But the Hemi Cuda was dangerous precisely because it was so powerful. The chassis simply wasn't designed to handle this kind of output. The rear suspension would hop and skip under hard acceleration. The front end would lift so high that steering became a suggestion rather than a command, and the brakes were woefully inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. Add in the fact that the Hemi required constant tuning. Those dual 4-barrel carburetors were temperamental at best, and you had a car that could stumble and surge at the worst possible moments. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased, with over 60% of the car's weight on the front axle. That made the car plow in corners until you lifted off the throttle. But lift mid-corner and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward. The rear tires would break loose, and you'd be fighting a drift whether you wanted one or not. The short wheelbase, 108 inches, made weight transfer dramatic and sudden. There was no gentle progression from grip to slip, just an instant transition that required lightning-fast reflexes to catch. Only about 650 Hemi Cudas were built in 1970, which made them rare even when new. Today they're worth millions, but back then they were just dangerous street cars that separated brave drivers from survivors. The Hemi engine was also expensive to maintain. It required specialized knowledge to tune properly, and parts were expensive even when new. The dual Carter AFB carburetors needed to be synchronized perfectly, and the mechanical lifters required regular valve adjustments. The cooling system was marginal at best, which meant the Hemi ran hot in traffic and could overheat if you weren't careful. Number 7. The 1971 Dodge Challenger RT4 406 pack. Dodge's pony car entry had always been bigger and more brutal than the competition, and the 1971 Challenger RT with the 446 pack was no exception. The engine used 3 2-barrel carburetors to feed 490 cubic inches of Mopar muscle. It made 385 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to make the 3,600-pound Challenger genuinely quick. The quarter mile came in the mid-13s, and 0 to 60 took around 6 seconds, but the power delivery was the real story. Those 3 carburetors created a progressive but unpredictable throttle response. At part throttle, only the center carburetor was working, and the car felt docile and manageable. But open it up and the outboard carburetors would kick in, and suddenly you'd have way more power than the chassis could handle. The rear end would break loose, the car would step sideways, and you'd be fighting to maintain control. The Challenger was also huge, over 110 inches in wheelbase, and nearly 16 feet long overall. That size made it stable at high speeds, but unwieldy in traffic or on tight roads. The steering was slow and heavy, requiring nearly 5 full turns lock to lock. The brakes were better than some competitors, especially if you had the optional front discs, but they still struggled with fade, during repeated hard stops. And the weight distribution was heavily nose-forward, with that big wedge head engine sitting far ahead of the front axle. That made understeer a constant companion during spirited driving. The six-pack induction system was also temperamental. The vacuum-operated valves that controlled the outboard carburetors could stick or leak, causing rough running and poor performance. The linkage required careful adjustment to ensure all three carburetors opened in sync, and the system was sensitive to fuel quality. Run low-octane gas, and the engine would ping and detonate under load. But when everything was working correctly, the six-pack Challenger was a monster that could run with anything on the street. Number 6. The 1970 Chevrolet Corvette LS554. The Corvette had always been America's sports car, but the 1970 version with the LS5454 engine was more muscle car than sports car. That massive 7.4-liter V8 made 390 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to propel the Corvette from 0 to 60 in around 5.5 seconds. The quarter mile came in the high 30s. Those were impressive numbers, but they came with serious consequences. The Corvette's fiberglass body meant it was relatively light at around 3,300 pounds, but the chassis dynamics were primitive by modern standards. The weight distribution was heavily front-biased because of that massive engine, which meant understeer was a constant companion. Push hard into a corner and the front end would plow straight ahead, no matter how much you turned the steering wheel. But lift off the throttle mid-corner and suddenly all that weight would transfer rearward, the rear tires would break loose, and you'd be in a drift whether you wanted one or not. The steering was quick but not particularly communicative, which meant you didn't always know what the front tires were doing until it was too late. The independent rear suspension was sophisticated for the era, but it could be unpredictable under hard use. Hit a bump mid-corner and the rear end could kick sideways without warning. The brakes were four-wheel discs, which was better than most muscle cars of the era, but they still struggled with fade during hard use. What made the LS5 Corvette truly dangerous was its power-to-weight ratio. With nearly 400 horsepower and a relatively light chassis, this car could accelerate hard enough to surprise even experienced drivers. The rear end would break loose without much provocation, especially in the wet, and catching a slide required skill and quick reflexes. The Corvette attracted drivers who saw themselves as skilled enthusiasts, but the car had a way of exposing the difference between confidence and competence. The combination of serious power, primitive chassis dynamics, and a buyer demographic that sometimes valued image over ability led to a lot of crashed Corvettes. Number 5. The 1970 Ford Mustang Boss 429. Ford's biggest mistake was also one of their most memorable muscle cars. The Boss 429 was created to dominate NASCAR, which required Ford to build a certain number of production versions to qualify for racing homologation. So, they took the Mustang's relatively compact body and shoehorned in Ford's biggest big block, the 429 cubic inch V8 that made 175 horsepower officially, but probably closer to 450 in reality. The result was a car that was breathtakingly fast in a straight line and absolutely terrifying everywhere else. The front end was so heavy that the Mustang handled like a freight train. Understeer was severe, and the steering was vague and slow. The front suspension was overwhelmed by the weight, causing the car to plow straight ahead in corners. And the weight distribution was so bad, nearly 65% on the front axle, that the car felt nose-heavy and unbalanced at all times. But punch the throttle and the Boss 429 would rocket forward with violence that took your breath away. The quarter mile came in the mid-13s, and 60 miles per hour arrived in under 6 seconds. The engine made its power at the top of the rev range, which meant you had to rev it hard to get maximum performance. But the solid lifter valve train made a mechanical racket that sounded like the engine was destroying itself. Only about 859 were built, which made them rare and valuable. But they were also difficult to drive and impossible to insure for most buyers. The Boss 429 represented Ford's commitment to winning races at any cost, even if that cost was building a car that was barely drivable on the street. Number 4. The 1970 Dodge Coronet RT Hemi. Dodge's full-size muscle car entry was often overlooked next to the more famous Charger and Challenger. But the Coronet RT with the Hemi engine was every bit as dangerous. The 426 cubic inch Hemi made 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque, installed in a car that weighed nearly 3,800 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio wasn't as favorable as smaller cars, but the Coronet made up for it with brute force. The quarter mile came in the mid-13s, and the acceleration from a rolling start was simply devastating. The Hemi's massive torque meant the car could pull like a freight train from any speed, but the Coronet's size and weight made it difficult to control at the limit. The steering was slow and vague, the brakes were marginal, and the suspension was tuned for comfort rather than performance. The rear suspension used leaf springs and a solid axle, which meant wheel hop was a constant problem during hard acceleration. The long wheelbase, 117 inches, helped with straight-line stability, but made the car feel ponderous in corners. What made the Coronet Hemi truly dangerous was its relative anonymity. It looked like any other full-size Dodge sedan, which meant people constantly underestimated it. And when the driver of that ordinary-looking sedan stomped on the throttle and those dual 4-barrel carburetors opened up, the results were often catastrophic for whoever was unfortunate enough to be racing against it. The Hemi Coronet was a sleeper in the truest sense, a car that looked boring but performed like a race car. Number 3, the 1971 Ford Mustang Boss 351. The Boss 351 was Ford's high-revving answer to the Chevrolet Z28 and Pontiac Trans Am. It featured a cleverly disguised 351 cubic inch V8, created by destroying the blocks and putting together the largest small block Ford could build. That made 330 horsepower, officially but probably 400 horses in reality. The engine could rev to 7,000 RPM, which was unheard of for a big displacement American V8. The Boss 351 could hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the low 14 seconds. But what made it dangerous was its Jekyll and Hyde personality. Drive it normally and it felt docile, with smooth power delivery and reasonable handling, but push it hard and it transformed into something wild. The high-revving engine encouraged aggressive driving, and the suspension was stiff enough to handle spirited cornering. But the rear end could break loose suddenly and violently if you pushed too hard, and the brakes were marginal for sustained hard use. The Boss 351 was a car that rewarded skill and punished mistakes, and it attracted drivers who sometimes had more enthusiasm than ability. Number 2, the 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner 440+6. Plymouth's cartoon-themed muscle car was never subtle, and the 1970 version with the 440+6 engine was the most extreme expression of that philosophy. 3 2-barrel carburetors fed 490 cubic inches of angry V8, creating 390 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. The Roadrunner could run the quarter mile in the mid-13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. But it weighed over 3,700 pounds, and that weight came with consequences. The chassis was never designed for this much power, and it showed. The steering was slow and vague, the brakes were barely adequate, and the suspension allowed massive body roll in corners. The power delivery from those 3 carburetors was unpredictable. Docile at part throttle, violent when all 3 opened up, get on the power mid-corner, and the rear end would step out so quickly that only experienced drivers could catch it. The Roadrunner was a straight-line weapon that could embarrass almost anything at a stoplight, but became genuinely dangerous when asked to turn or stop. Number 1, the 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible. At the top of our list sits the rarest, most dangerous, and most valuable muscle car of the 1970s, the Hemi Cuda convertible. Only 7 of these were built in 1970, which makes them unicorns today. But back then, they were just insanely powerful convertibles that could kill you if you didn't respect what you were sitting in. Under the hood sat the legendary 426 cubic inch Hemi 58, making 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. But those numbers were fiction. Real output was closer to 500 horses, and the Hemi's torque curve was as flat and brutal as a baseball bat to the head. The Hemi Cuda convertible could run the quarter mile in the low 13s and hit 60 in under 6 seconds. Those were numbers that would still be impressive today. And this was 1970, with bias-ply tires and no electronic aids whatsoever. But add in the fact that this was a convertible, which meant the chassis had less structural rigidity than the hardtop, and you had a recipe for disaster. The body would flex under hard acceleration or during aggressive cornering, which made the handling even more unpredictable than it already was. The steering was vague, the suspension was overwhelmed, and the brakes were laughably inadequate for the speeds this car could reach. The Hemi engine required constant attention. Those dual 4-barrel carburetors needed regular tuning, and when they weren't perfectly synchronized, the engine would stumble and surge. That unpredictability was dangerous when you were already trying to manage 500 horsepower through tires that had maybe half the grip of modern rubber. The convertible top also meant visibility was compromised when it was up, and wind buffeting was severe when it was down at high speeds. What made the Hemi Cuda convertible the most dangerous muscle car of the 70s was the combination of insane power, compromised structure, primitive chassis dynamics, and absolute rarity. These cars were so expensive and so rare that most owners didn't drive them hard enough to learn their limits, and when they did, the results were often catastrophic. The Hemi Cuda convertible represented the absolute peak of American muscle. Powerful, beautiful, rare, and willing to kill you without a moment's hesitation if you made a mistake. Today, they're worth millions and sit in climate-controlled garages, but back in 1970, they were street-legal race cars that demanded respect and punished anything less. Think the 70s were rough? The 1980s delivered another wave of 16 machines ready to bite back. Some decades are remembered for innovation, others for restraint. But the 1980s? That was the decade that refused to die quietly. While the world thought American muscle was finished, strangled by emissions laws and insurance premiums, a handful of engineers kept the fire burning. These weren't the giants of 1969. They were leaner, meaner, and in some cases, more dangerous than anything that came before. Today, we're counting down 16 deadliest 80s muscle cars ever made. Machines that proved horsepower never truly dies. It just adapts. Number 16, the 1984 Dodge Daytona Turbo Z. It didn't look like much at first glance. A front-wheel drive hatchback with angular lines and pop-up headlights that screamed economy car more than performance legend. But beneath that unassuming shell, Dodge had planted something genuinely lethal. A turbocharged 2.2-liter four-cylinder that delivered 142 horsepower. In 1984, that was respectable. What made it deadly wasn't just the power, though. It was the handling. The Daytona Turbo Z could corner like it was on rails, and its light front end meant you could rotate it through turns with throttle alone. For drivers used to heavy muscle from the 60s, this was a revelation. It weighed just over 2,600 pounds, which meant every ounce of boost counted. The quarter mile came in around 16 seconds flat, not earth-shattering, but quick enough to surprise Camaros at the stoplight. What made it dangerous was its unpredictability. Turbo lag was real in the 80s, and when that boost hit, it hit hard. Snap oversteer could catch inexperienced drivers off guard, especially in the rain. The front-wheel drive layout meant torque steer was always lurking, ready to yank the wheel from your hands during hard acceleration. Dodge had built a front driver that could bite, and it wore that reputation proudly. This was muscle for a new generation. Smaller, sharper, and just as willing to put you in a ditch if you weren't paying attention. Number 15, the 1982 Chevrolet Camaro Z28 Indy 500 Pace Car. Chevrolet knew how to make an entrance. When they were selected to pace the 1982 Indianapolis 500, they didn't just slap some decals on a base model and call it done. They built a limited edition Z28 with graphics that screamed speed, even when it was standing still. Silver and blue stripes wrapped the body, and those iconic hockey stick decals ran down the sides like racing stripes from a different dimension. Under the hood sat the venerable 5.0-liter V8, pushing out 165 horsepower through a 4-barrel carburetor. By modern standards, that sounds tame. But in 1982, when the average family sedan was wheezing out 90 horses, this was a war machine. The Crossfire fuel injection system would arrive later, but this carbureted beast had character. A lumpy idle, a growl that rattled windows, and a torque curve that could spin those rear tires from a dead stop all the way through second gear. The real danger here wasn't just the power, it was the chassis. Chevy had dialed in the suspension for performance, which meant it was stiff, responsive, and absolutely unforgiving. Hit a bump mid-corner, and the rear end could step out without warning. The steering was quick for the era, but that meant overcorrections happened fast. Add in rear-wheel drive, bias-ply tires if you were running period-correct rubber, and a dose of youthful overconfidence, and you had a recipe for disaster. This wasn't a muscle car that forgave mistakes, it punished them. Number 14. The 1983 Ford Mustang GT. Ford brought the Fox body Mustang back from the dead in 1983, and they did it with attitude. The GT model came equipped with a 5.0-liter V8 that produced 175 horsepower. Not a lot by classic muscle standards, but enough to make the lightweight Fox chassis come alive. This was the year Ford started to remember what performance meant. The car weighed just over 3,000 pounds, which gave it a power-to-weight ratio that felt genuinely aggressive. Quarter-mile times hovered around the high 15-second range, which made it competitive with nearly anything else on American roads at the time. But the real story was the handling. Ford had stiffened the suspension, added front and rear sway bars, and bolted on some genuinely sticky Goodyear Eagle GT tires. This thing could corner. The problem was that it could also snap. The rear suspension geometry was primitive by modern standards, and liftoff oversteer was a constant threat. Back off the throttle mid-corner and the tail would swing wide, turning a spirited drive into a white-knuckle drift. Inexperienced drivers found themselves facing the wrong direction more than once. The brakes were adequate at best, which meant stopping distances were longer than confidence levels suggested. And yet, that was part of the appeal. This was a muscle car that demanded respect. It rewarded skill and punished hubris. In the hands of someone who knew what they were doing, it was a scalpel. In the wrong hands, it was a wrecking ball. The Fox body became a cult classic, precisely because it was so unforgiving, so raw, so willing to remind you that driving fast requires more than just a heavy right foot. Number 13. The 1985 Pontiac Trans Am. The third-generation Trans Am arrived in 1982, but by 1985, Pontiac had refined it into something truly menacing. The standard engine was still the 5.0-liter V8, but now it was making closer to 200 horsepower, thanks to tuned port fuel injection. That might not sound like much, but in a car that weighed around 3,200 pounds and had the aerodynamics of a fighter jet, it was enough. The Trans Am could hit 60 miles per hour in just under 7 seconds, and the quarter mile came in around 15.5 seconds. For the mid-80s, that was genuinely quick. But speed wasn't what made this car deadly. It was the mystique. Drivers who climbed behind the wheel thought they were piloting KITT from Knight Rider, or channeling Burt Reynolds in Smokey and the Bandit. That confidence often exceeded their actual driving ability. The Trans Am had a low, wide stance that inspired aggressive cornering, but the chassis wasn't quite as planted as it looked. The rear end could break loose without much provocation, especially on cold tires or damp pavement. And once it started to slide, correcting it required finesse and quick hands. The steering was responsive but not communicative. You didn't always feel what the front tires were doing until it was too late. Add in the fact that many of these cars were driven by younger buyers who saw them as invincible, and you had a combination that led to more than a few guardrail encounters. This was a car that looked fast sitting still, and that made people forget that looking fast and being controllable weren't always the same thing. Number 12, the 1987 Buick GNX. Now we're getting serious. The Buick GNX wasn't just a muscle car, it was a statement. A middle finger to anyone who thought American performance was dead. Buick took their already menacing Grand National and turned it into something that could embarrass Corvettes and Porsches without breaking a sweat. Under that sinister black hood sat a turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 that cranked out 276 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque. Those were factory numbers, and everyone knew they were conservative. Independent testing showed the GNX was making closer to 300 horses at the crank. It could blast from 0 to 60 in under 5 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-13s. In 1987, that was Ferrari territory. What made it deadly was the power delivery. This wasn't a smooth, linear rush. It was a violent surge. The turbo would spool up and then, boom, you were shoved back into the seat like you'd been rear-ended by a freight train. The rear tires would light up even with traction control, doing its best to keep things civil. And because this was based on a mid-sized sedan platform, the chassis wasn't exactly designed for this kind of punishment. The steering was numb, the brakes were adequate at best, and the suspension was tuned for straight-line speed more than cornering finesse. Get on the power too early coming out of a turn, and the rear end would step out, sending you into an unplanned drift. The GNX demanded respect. It was fast, furious, and unforgiving. Only 547 were built, which made them instant collectibles. But it also meant that every time one left the showroom, there was a decent chance it would end up wrapped around something solid. The all-black paint scheme added to the intimidation factor. This car looked like it belonged in a villain's garage, and it drove like it too. Number 11, the 1989 Chevrolet Camaro IROC-Z. The IROC-Z was the poster child of late 80s excess. It had ground effects, hood louvers, aggressive wheels, and a name that came from the International Race of Champions series. This wasn't a subtle car, it was a rolling declaration of intent. The top engine option was the 5.7-liter V8, pushing out 240 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque. That was enough to make the IROC-Z genuinely quick. 0 to 60 came in just over 6 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the low 15s. For 1989, that was serious performance. The handling was also surprisingly good. Chevy had tuned the suspension to be both comfortable and capable, which meant you could carve corners with confidence. But here's where it got dangerous. The IROC-Z looked so good that people forgot it still had limitations. The rear suspension used a solid axle, which meant it could hop and skip under hard acceleration or over uneven pavement. Mid-corner bumps could unsettle the whole car, and if you were already pushing the limits, that could send you sideways in a hurry. The brakes were better than earlier models, but still not up to the task of repeatedly hauling this 3,300-pound beast down from triple-digit speeds. Fade was real, and more than one track day ended with boiling brake fluid and a long, terrifying runoff into the grass. The real danger, though, was the culture. The IROC-Z became a symbol of speed, of style, of a certain kind of 80s attitude, and that meant it attracted drivers who wanted to live up to the image, even if their skills didn't match their ambitions. It was a car that rewarded talent and exposed pretenders. The combination of genuine capability and widespread appeal meant these cars were everywhere, and that meant they were crashed everywhere too. Number 10, the 1986 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. By 1986, Pontiac had perfected the third-generation Firebird formula. The Trans Am wore its aggression on its sleeve, bold graphics, a ground-hugging stance, and a front end that looked like it wanted to devour the road. Under the hood, the top engine was the tuned port-injected 5.0-liter V8, making around 210 horsepower. That might not sound apocalyptic, but in a car that weighed just over 3,200 pounds, it was more than enough to get into trouble. The Trans Am could hit 60 in around 7 seconds and run the quarter in the mid-15s. More importantly, it handled. Pontiac had tuned the suspension to be sharp and responsive, with limited body roll and surprisingly good grip. The WS6 performance package added even more capability, with stiffer springs and specially tuned dampers that made the car feel like it was glued to the road. But that confidence came at a cost. The car was tail-happy. The rear suspension geometry meant that throttle inputs mid-corner could quickly overwhelm the rear tires, especially if they were worn or if the pavement was anything less than perfect. Lift-off oversteer was a constant threat, and the steering, while quick, didn't always communicate what was happening at the front axle until it was too late. The brakes were also a weak point. They were adequate for normal driving, but not up to the task of hard, repeated stops. Fade set in quickly, and that meant stopping distances grew alarmingly long after a few aggressive runs. What made this car deadly wasn't just its capabilities. It was the way it made you feel. Sit behind that steering wheel, fire up that V8, and you felt invincible. And that feeling led to a lot of bad decisions on back roads and highway on-ramps across America. Number 9, the 1985 Chevrolet Monte Carlo SS. Chevrolet took their dowdy Monte Carlo and turned it into something menacing with the SS package. It was a strange choice, a two-door coupe with a formal roofline, dressed up with ground effects, bucket seats, and a 5.0-liter V8 under the hood. The engine made 180 horsepower, which doesn't sound like much, but the Monte Carlo SS wasn't about brute force. It was about presence. This was NASCAR homologation made street legal. The aerodynamics were slippery for the era, and the car had a planted, stable feel at highway speeds. Chevy designed the nose and tail specifically to slice through the air with minimal drag, which is why the SS could cruise comfortably at speeds that would make other cars of the era feel unstable. But that stability was deceptive. The Monte Carlo SS was built on a rear-wheel drive platform with a live rear axle, and that meant it could get squirrely in a hurry if you weren't careful. The weight distribution was nose-heavy, which made the front end plow in tight corners. But get on the throttle too early and the rear would break loose, turning understeer into oversteer in the blink of an eye. The steering was slow and vague, which meant corrections had to be made early and with authority. Wait too long and you'd be along for the ride. The brakes were also marginal, especially for a car that weighed over 3,500 pounds. Stopping distances were long, and fade was a real concern on any kind of spirited drive. What made the Monte Carlo SS deadly was the disconnect between expectation and reality. It looked like a race car, and Chevy marketed it as one, but it was still a heavy, front-heavy coupe that required skill and respect to drive quickly. A lot of people learned that lesson the hard way, discovering that NASCAR looks and NASCAR handling are two very different things. Number 8, the 1989 Ford Mustang GT. By the end of the decade, Ford had turned the Fox body Mustang into a genuinely formidable machine. The 1989 GT came with a 5.0-liter V8 that produced 225 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque. That was a significant jump from earlier models, and it showed. The Mustang could now hit 60 in under 6 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-14s. For 1989, that was legitimately fast. The handling had also improved. Ford had stiffened the chassis, upgraded the brakes, and fitted wider tires. The result was a car that could corner hard and brake late, but it was still a Fox body, which meant it still had quirks. The rear suspension was a live axle with 4 links, and it could hop and skip under hard acceleration or over rough pavement. Mid-corner bumps could unsettle the entire rear end, sending the car into a sudden, unplanned drift. The steering was quick but not particularly communicative, which meant you didn't always know when the front tires were about to give up. And the brakes, while improved, were still marginal for sustained hard use. Track days often ended with warped rotors and smoking pads. What made the 89 GT deadly was its accessibility. It was relatively affordable, easy to modify, and fast enough to make inexperienced drivers feel like heroes. That combination led to a lot of overconfidence and even more crashed Mustangs. This was a car that rewarded smooth inputs and punished aggression, but it looked so good and sounded so mean that people often forgot that part. The aftermarket support was incredible even back then, which meant young drivers could bolt on more power before they'd learn to handle what they already had. Number 7, the 1988 Chevrolet Camaro IROC-Z with 5.7-liter V8. The 1988 IROC-Z was the pinnacle of third-generation Camaro performance. Chevy had ironed out most of the rough edges by this point, and the result was a car that could genuinely hustle. The 5.7-liter V8 produced 230 horsepower and 330 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to propel this 3,300-pound coupe from 0 to 60 in just over 6 seconds. The quarter mile came in around 15 seconds flat, but the real story was the chassis. Chevy had tuned the suspension to be sharp and responsive, with minimal body roll and surprisingly good grip. The IROC-Z could carry serious speed through corners, and the steering, while not perfectly communicative, was quick enough to make rapid corrections. But that capability came with a catch. The solid rear axle could still hop and skip, especially over rough pavement or during hard acceleration. And the rear suspension geometry meant that lift-off oversteer was always lurking. Back off the throttle mid-corner, and the tail would swing wide, turning a controlled slide into a full-on spin if you weren't ready for it. The brakes were also a weak spot. They were adequate for street driving, but not up to the task of repeated hard stops. Fades set in quickly, and that meant stopping distances grew alarmingly long after just a few aggressive runs. What made this car deadly was its competence. It was good enough to make you feel like a hero, right up until it reminded you that physics doesn't care about confidence. More than one IROC-Z driver learned that lesson while staring at a crumpled front end and a destroyed guardrail. The tuned port injection system delivered power smoothly, which made it easy to forget just how much thrust you were unleashing until the scenery started blurring past the windows. Number 6, the 1987 Shelby Charger, GLHS. Carroll Shelby wasn't done with performance just because the 60s were over. In 1987, he teamed up with Dodge to create one of the wildest front-wheel drive performance cars ever built. The Shelby Charger GLHS, which stood for Goes Like Hellsmore, was a turbocharged pocket rocket that could embarrass cars twice its price. Under the hood sat a turbocharged 2.2-liter four-cylinder that cranked out 175 horsepower and 175 pound-feet of torque. That might not sound like much, but this car weighed just over 2,400 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio was genuinely impressive, and the turbo lag was real. When that boost hit, it hit hard, lighting up the front tires and pulling the steering wheel in your hands. The GLHS could hit 60 in under 7 seconds and run the quarter mile in the high 14 seconds. For a front-wheel drive hatchback, that was astounding, but it was also dangerous. Torque steer was a constant issue. Get on the power hard, and the car would lurch to one side, requiring constant steering corrections. Mid-corner acceleration was even worse. Apply throttle too aggressively, and the front end would plow wide, scrubbing off speed and sending you toward the outside of the turn. And because this was a front driver, snap oversteer wasn't something you had to worry about. Understeer was the enemy, and it was relentless. The brakes were also marginal, which meant stopping distances were longer than you'd expect for such a light car. Only 500 GLHS models were built, which made them instant collectibles. But it also meant that every time one hit the street, there was a decent chance the driver was about to learn a hard lesson about front-wheel drive dynamics. Shelby had taken a platform never meant for performance and turned it into something genuinely lethal. Number 5, the 1984 Ford Mustang SVO. Ford decided to build a Mustang that wasn't about cubic inches and V8 rumble. The SVO was something different, a turbocharged, fuel-injected, tech-forward performance car that prioritized handling and efficiency over raw displacement. Under the hood sat a turbocharged 2.3-liter four-cylinder that produced 175 horsepower and 210 pound-feet of torque. That might not sound like much compared to the V8 models, but the SVO weighed around 3,000 pounds, and the Turbo 4 delivered its power in a way that felt explosive. Turbo lag was significant, which meant there was a pause between when you stabbed the throttle and when the boost hit. And when it did hit, it hit hard, lighting up the rear tires and sending you hurtling forward. The SVO could hit 60 in around 7.5 seconds and run the quarter mile in the mid-15s. But the real magic was in the handling. Ford fitted the SVO with adjustable Coney shocks, a unique suspension setup, 4-wheel disc brakes, and 16-inch wheels with performance rubber. This thing could corner. The steering was sharp, the chassis was balanced, and the brakes were genuinely good. But that capability was also dangerous. The SVO made you feel like you could carry absurd speeds through corners, and most of the time, you could. But the rear suspension was still a live axle, which meant it could hop and skip over bumps, hit a mid-corner imperfection, and the rear end could step out without warning, turning a controlled slide into a white-knuckle moment. The SVO demanded respect. It rewarded smooth, deliberate inputs and punished ham-fisted aggression. And because it looked so understated, no flashy graphics, no hood scoops, a lot of people underestimated it. That was a mistake. The SVO was a thinking man's muscle car, and it separated the skilled from the lucky with brutal efficiency. Number 4. The 1989 Pontiac Firebird Trans Am GTA. The GTA was Pontiac's answer to the question, what if we took the Trans Am and made it even more extreme? The result was a car that combined serious power with genuinely impressive handling. Under the hood sat the 5.7-liter V8, tuned port injected and producing 240 horsepower and 345 pound-feet of torque. That was enough to push the GTA from 0 to 60 in around 6 seconds and through the quarter mile in the low 15s. But the real story was the chassis. Pontiac fitted the GTA with WS6 performance suspension, which included stiffer springs, bigger sway bars, and specially tuned shocks. They also added four-wheel disc brakes, which were a rarity in the 80s. The result was a car that could corner hard, brake late, and accelerate out of turns with authority. The GTA felt like it had been engineered with a track day in mind, not just straight-line acceleration, but it was also a car that could kill you if you weren't careful. The rear suspension was still a live axle, and it could hop and skip under hard acceleration or over rough pavement. Mid-corner bumps could unsettle the entire rear end, sending the car into a sudden slide. And because the GTA had so much grip, when it finally let go, it let go suddenly. There was no gentle progression from grip to slip, just a sudden transition that required lightning-fast reflexes to catch. The brakes, while good, could still fade under hard, repeated use, and the steering, though responsive, didn't always communicate what was happening at the front axle. What made the GTA deadly was its competence. It was good enough to make you believe you were invincible, right up until it reminded you that you weren't. This was a car that demanded respect, skill, and humility. Forget any of those, and you were in trouble. The GTA represented the pinnacle of what Pontiac could squeeze from the F-body platform, and it was glorious and terrifying in equal measure. Number 3, the 1987 Buick Regal Grand National. Before the GNX, there was the Grand National, and while it didn't have the outrageous performance of its more famous sibling, it was still a car that could catch you off guard in the worst possible way. The Grand National came with a turbocharged 3.8-liter V6 that produced 245 horsepower and 355 pound-feet of torque. That was enough to propel this 3,500-pound coupe from 0 to 60 in under 7 seconds and through the quarter mile in the mid-14s. For 1987, that was legitimately quick, but the power delivery was the real story. The turbo would spool up and then, wham! You'd be shoved back into the seat like someone had just lit the afterburners. The rear tires would break loose, the back end would step out, and suddenly you were in a drift whether you wanted to be or not. The chassis wasn't built for this kind of punishment. The Grand National was based on a mid-sized sedan platform, which meant the steering was slow and vague, the suspension was soft, and the brakes were marginal at best. The rear suspension used a solid axle with coil springs, which meant it could hop and skip under hard acceleration. And because the car was nose-heavy, the weight transfer under braking was dramatic, making it easy to lock up the front wheels and plow straight into whatever you were trying to avoid. What made the Grand National deadly was the combination of brutal power and mediocre chassis dynamics. It was fast in a straight line, terrifying in the corners, and unforgiving of mistakes. And because it looked so understated, just a blacked-out coupe with no flashy graphics, people often underestimated it until it was too late. The Grand National proved that you didn't need a V8 to build a muscle car that could bite, and it did so with an attitude that was pure 80s cool. Number 2, the 1987 Chevrolet Camaro IROC-Z with TPI and Performance Handling Package. This was the ultimate expression of third-generation Camaro performance. Chevy took the already potent IROC-Z and added the tuned port injection 5.7-liter V8, along with the 1LE Performance Handling Package. The result was a car that could run with nearly anything on American roads. The engine produced 225 horsepower and 340 pound-feet of torque, which was enough to push the car from 0 to 60 in just under 6 seconds. The quarter mile came in the low 15 seconds, but the real magic was in the handling. The 1LE package included stiffer springs, bigger sway bars, revised shock tuning, and upgraded brakes. The result was a car that could corner flat, brake hard, and accelerate out of turns with minimal drama. Chevy had essentially built a street-legal race car, one that could hang with European sports cars on a twisty road while still offering V8 rumble and American muscle attitude. But it was also a car that could bite. The rear suspension was still a solid axle, which meant it could hop and skip over rough pavement, or during hard acceleration. Mid-corner bumps could unsettle the entire car, sending it into a sudden, violent drift. And because the IROC-Z had so much grip from the upgraded suspension and sticky tires, when it finally let go, it let go fast. There was no gentle slide, just a sudden transition from grip to slip that required instant reflexes to catch. The brakes, while improved, could still fade under sustained hard use, and the steering, though quick, didn't always telegraph what was happening at the front axle. What made this car deadly was its Jekyll and Hyde personality. Most of the time, it was composed, capable, and confidence-inspiring. But push it past the limit, and it would snap into oversteer so quickly that only experienced drivers could catch it. This was a car that rewarded skill and destroyed egos. The 1LE package was a relatively rare option, which meant most people had never experienced just how capable a third-gen Camaro could be until they found themselves trying to keep up with one on a canyon road. Number 1. The 1987 Buick GNX, the ultimate 80s assassin. At the top of our list sits the king of 80s muscle, the Buick GNX. We mentioned it earlier, but it deserves this top spot for a reason. This wasn't just a fast car, it was a statement. A middle finger to everyone who said American performance was dead. Buick took their already menacing Grand National, handed it over to McLaren Performance Technologies and ASC, and told them to build something apocalyptic. What they created was a car that could humble Corvettes, embarrass Porsches, and rewrite the rules of what a muscle car could be. Under the hood sat a turbocharged and intercooled 3.8-liter V6 that officially made 276 horsepower and 3 160 pound-feet of torque. But those numbers were conservative to the point of comedy. Independent testing showed the GNX was making closer to 300 horsepower at the crank, and the torque was even more underrated. This thing could launch 0 to 60 came in 4.6 seconds. The quarter-mile passed in 12.7 seconds at 113 miles per hour. In 1987, those were supercar numbers, Ferrari and Porsche territory. And Buick did it with a turbocharged V6 in a blacked-out coupe that looked like it was carved from a single block of menace. The modifications that McLaren made were significant. A ceramic turbocharger, a low-restriction exhaust, a specially calibrated transmission, wider wheels, and unique fender flares that gave the car an even more aggressive stance. But the speed was only part of the story. What made the GNX truly deadly was the way it delivered that power. The turbo lag was real, a brief pause where nothing happened, and then the boost would hit like a freight train. The rear tires would light up, the back end would step out, and you'd be fighting the steering wheel just to keep the car pointed straight. The chassis wasn't designed for this kind of punishment. The steering was numb and slow, the suspension was soft, and the brakes were barely adequate. This was a car built to go fast in a straight line, not carve corners. Get on the power mid-turn, and the rear end would break loose, sending you into an unplanned drift that required real skill to catch. The weight distribution was nose-heavy, which made the front end plow in tight corners. But get the tail out, and suddenly you had a rear-drive drift machine that demanded total commitment. The brakes were the real weak point. They were adequate for street driving, but absolutely not up to the task of repeatedly hauling this 3,700-pound beast down from triple-digit speeds. Fades set in quickly, and stopping distances grew alarmingly long after just a few hard runs. What made the GNX the deadliest muscle car of the 80s was the combination of brutal power, mediocre chassis dynamics, and an attitude that said, "I dare you to keep up." Only 547 were built, and each one was a rolling testament to the idea that horsepower never dies, it just evolves. This was Buick's way of saying goodbye to the Turbo 6 era, and they did it by building a car that could embarrass nearly anything on the road. The GNX wasn't just fast, it was ferocious, it was unforgiving, and it was absolutely undeniably deadly in the hands of anyone who didn't respect what they were sitting on top of. Collectors today pay six-figure sums for clean examples, but back in '87, you could walk into a Buick dealership and drive home with a car that could outrun a Corvette for less money. That kind of performance accessibility meant these cars ended up in hands that weren't always ready for what they'd unleashed. These 16 machines weren't just cars. They were rolling testaments to an era that refused to surrender. While the world thought muscle was dead, these engineers kept the flame alive with turbochargers, fuel injection, and sheer determination. Some were brutal, others were sophisticated, but every single one could put you in a guardrail if you forgot that horsepower and skill don't always arrive in equal measure. The 80s taught us that muscle could evolve, that power could come from unexpected places, and that danger didn't disappear just because displacement got smaller. And the danger didn't fade in the 80s. The 1990s brought their own 16 killers disguised as muscle cars. The 1990s was supposed to be the decade muscle died. Insurance companies had won, emissions strangled horsepower. But beneath the surface, something dangerous was brewing. Engineers who grew up worshiping big blocks were quietly plotting revenge. Today, we're counting down 16 deadliest 90s muscle cars ever made. Machines that proved American V8s weren't finished. They were just getting started. From factory sleepers to limited edition monsters, these are the cars that brought raw power screaming back from the dead. Number 16, 1996, Chevrolet Impala SS. Let's begin with the car that reminded America what a full-size sedan could do when you stopped apologizing for horsepower. The 1996 Chevrolet Impala SS arrived like a shadow from a different era, dressed entirely in black, with just enough chrome to catch streetlight. This wasn't your grandfather's Impala. This was Chevrolet saying muscle never really left. It just learned to wear a suit. While imports dominated sports car magazines and minivans filled suburban driveways, the Impala SS proved that big American sedans could still quicken your pulse. Under that long hood sat the LT1, a 5.7-liter V8 borrowed from the Corvette, pumping out 260 horsepower and 330 pound-feet of torque. For a car tipping the scales at over 4,000 pounds, those numbers translate into genuine speed that could surprise unsuspecting sports car drivers at red lights. 0 to 60 arrived in 6.5 seconds, and the quarter-mile disappeared in the low 15-second range. The 4-speed automatic transmission shifted with purpose, feeding power to a limited slip differential that could light up both rear tires on command. But numbers only tell half the story. The Impala SS had presence. It sat lower than standard Caprices, rode on 17-inch aluminum wheels, and wore blacked-out trim that made it look like an unmarked police car from a future where cops had taste. Inside, bucket seats and a floor-mounted shifter created a cockpit feel that full-size sedans had abandoned decades earlier. The analog gauges glowed white at night, casting shadows across a dashboard that felt purposeful and mean. Chevrolet only built about 41,000 Impala SS models across 3 model years, making them rare enough to turn heads, but common enough that you could actually find one. Today, clean examples command serious money, especially the all-black 94 through 96 models. This was the car that proved you didn't need a 2-door coupe to deliver muscle car thrills. Sometimes the deadliest predators are the ones nobody sees coming until it's too late. Number 15, 1994, Ford Mustang Cobra. Ford's special vehicle team knew they had a problem. The Mustang had been neutered for years, its fangs pulled by regulations and bean counters, who forgot what made muscle cars matter in the first place. The 1994 Cobra was their answer, and it came with a promise written in displacement and boost. This wasn't just a Mustang with stripes. This was Ford, reminding the world that American V8s could still make your palms sweat and your heart race. The 5.0-liter pushrod V8 produced 240 horsepower and 285 pound-feet of torque, channeled through either a 5-speed manual transmission or an optional 4-speed automatic. That power pushed the Cobra from 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds, and through the quarter mile in the high 13-second range. The independent rear suspension, lifted from the Thunderbird Super Coupe, finally gave the Mustang the handling to match its straight-line speed. Walk around a 94 Cobra, and you'd see the details that separated it from lesser Mustangs. The hood wore functional vents. The wheels measured 17 inches and wore aggressive rubber. The exhaust note carried a distinctive burble that announced your arrival blocks before you turned the corner. Inside, white-faced gauges and leather-wrapped everything created an environment that felt special, not just sporty. Ford built just over 5,000 Cobras for 1994, split between coupes and convertibles. The aggressive front fascia, side scoops, and rear wing weren't just for show. They helped the Cobra slice through air at speeds that would have terrified early muscle car drivers. This was the foundation that would lead to even more dangerous Cobras in years to come. But the '94 model proved Ford was serious about reclaiming muscle car glory. In black or Rio red, it looked like trouble wrapped in fiberglass and fury. Number 14, 1991, GMC Syclone. Here's where things get weird and wonderful. GMC took a compact pickup truck, strapped a turbocharger to a V6, added all-wheel drive, and created something that embarrassed sports cars at stoplights across America. The 1991 Syclone shouldn't have existed. It made no practical sense. It couldn't tow heavy loads, and the bed was too small for serious work. But that's exactly why it became legendary. The 4.3-liter turbocharged V6 generated 280 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque. That might not sound earth-shattering until you consider the Syclone's curb weight of just over 3,500 pounds, and its sophisticated all-wheel drive system that could put power down without drama. 0 to 60 happened in 4.3 seconds. Read that again, 4.3 seconds. In 1991, that was Ferrari territory. The quarter-mile fell in the low 13-second range, fast enough to humiliate Corvettes and Mustangs. GMC only built 2,998 Syclones, all in black with red accents. The truck sat low, riding on special suspension with monotube shocks. The body kit looked aggressive without being cartoonish. Inside, leather seats and full instrumentation reminded you this wasn't a work truck. The exhaust note was subdued, almost polite, which made surprising unsuspecting victims even sweeter. The Syclone proved that muscle wasn't just about big displacement V8s anymore. Turbocharging and all-wheel drive could deliver brutality that traditional rear-wheel drive V8s struggled to match. GMC followed it up with the Typhoon SUV, but the Syclone remains the purest expression of turbocharged madness in pickup form. Today, clean examples are collectible treasures, hunted by enthusiasts who appreciate engineering that defied convention and delivered results that redefined what a truck could do. Number 13, 1993, Ford Mustang Cobra R. Ford built the 1993 Cobra R for one reason: homologation. Racing rules required a certain number of street-legal cars before you could campaign a model in competition. Ford built exactly 107 Cobra Rs, stripped them of creature comforts, and sent them into the world as barely civilized race cars with license plates. The 5.0-liter V8 was massaged to produce 235 horsepower, which sounds modest until you realize Ford removed the air conditioning, radio, rear seat, and sound deadening. The Cobra R weighed hundreds of pounds less than a standard Mustang GT. It sat on massive 17-inch wheels wrapped in aggressive Goodyear rubber. The suspension was race spec, stiff enough to read Braille through the steering wheel on rough pavement. 0 to 60 took around 5.7 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the low 14-second range. But straight-line speed wasn't the point. The Cobra R could corner, it could brake, it could lap a road course faster than Mustangs that cost twice as much. The lack of radio meant you heard every mechanical sound: the intake sucking air, the exhaust roaring, the tires howling at the limit of adhesion. Ford only offered the Cobra R in vibrant red with white stripes and graphics. Every single one came with a certificate of authenticity and a build number. These weren't cars you drove to the grocery store. These were weapons you took to track days and vintage racing events. Today, Cobra Rs rarely change hands, and when they do, the prices reflect their rarity and purpose-built nature. This was Ford saying that if you wanted comfort, buy a Lincoln. If you wanted to win races, buy a Cobra R and accept no substitutions. Number 12, 1996 Pontiac Firebird Formula. While the Trans Am got all the attention with its screaming chicken graphics and boy racer aesthetic, the Formula was the thinking man's F-body. The 1996 Formula delivered nearly identical performance in a cleaner wrapper, and that subtlety made it deadlier on the street. This was Pontiac understanding that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that doesn't advertise. The LT1 V8, borrowed from Corvette and Camaro, produced 305 horsepower and 335 pound-feet of torque. That power flowed through either a 6-speed manual transmission with short mechanical throws or an optional 4-speed automatic. 0 to 60 arrived in just over 5 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the mid-13-second range at over 100 miles per hour. The Formula's aerodynamic nose and functional hood scoops weren't just styling exercises. They channeled air and reduced lift at triple-digit speeds. The Formula rode on the same suspension as the WS6 Trans Am, with stiff springs, thick anti-roll bars, and responsive steering that made it feel smaller and more agile than its 3,500-pound curb weight suggested. The brakes were massive for the era, 11.8-inch discs up front that could haul the Formula down from license-losing speeds repeatedly without fade. Inside, the digital dash displayed speed, RPM, and boost pressure with 80s vintage graphics that somehow still looked cool. Pontiac offered the Formula in colors like bright purple metallic and polo green, but the smartest buyers chose understated shades like white or silver. Without the Trans Am's body kit and graphics, the Formula looked almost innocent, like a sporty commuter car. Then you'd hear the exhaust note, a deep rumble that rose to a mechanical scream past 4,000 RPM, and you'd know this was something special. The Formula proved you didn't need a cartoon bird on your hood to run with the fastest cars on American roads. Number 11, 1992, Dodge Viper RT/10. The Dodge Viper wasn't trying to be subtle. It was America's middle finger to the idea that supercars had to come from Europe, wrapped in fiberglass, and powered by an engine that shared DNA with a truck. The 1992 Viper RT/10 arrived as a roadster with no roof, no windows, no traction control, and no apologies. This was Dodge asking how much power you could handle before physics and fear took over. The 8.0-liter V10 produced 400 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque, numbers that sound modest now, but felt apocalyptic in 1992. The power flowed through a 6-speed manual transmission to massive rear tires that existed primarily to keep the Viper pointed in the intended direction. 0 to 60 took around 4.6 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the high 12-second range. Top speed stretched past 160 miles per hour, limited only by aerodynamics and courage. The Viper's body was all curves and aggression, with side-exit exhaust pipes that could brand your leg if you weren't careful exiting the car. The interior was Spartan, 2 seats, minimal gauges, and a steering wheel that transmitted every texture of the road surface directly into your palms. There was no anti-lock braking system, no airbags, no power steering. The Viper demanded skill and respect, punishing mistakes with sudden, terrifying oversteer. Dodge built just under 1,500 Vipers for 1992 and 93 combined, all of them roadsters, most in Viper red. The car's long hood, low roofline, and aggressive stance made it unmistakable from any angle. The exhaust note was a mechanical symphony, all burbles and roars and crackling deceleration. The Viper proved American engineers could build a supercar that matched European exotics for speed and exceeded them for drama. It wasn't refined or sophisticated. It was raw, brutal, and absolutely deadly in the right hands. Number 10, 1998, Pontiac Trans Am WS6. If the Formula was the understated killer, the 1998 Trans Am WS6 was the car that kicked down your door and announced its presence with authority. This was the F-body at its absolute peak, right before GM killed the platform. The LS1 V8 had arrived, and everything changed. The 5.7-liter LS1 produced 325 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque, routed through either a 6-speed manual or 4-speed automatic. But the real story was how that power arrived, in a smooth, relentless wave that started low and pulled all the way to redline. 0 to 60 took just over 4.6 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the high 12-second range at 110 miles per hour. The WS6 package added functional ram air induction, performance exhaust, and specific tuning that made the Trans Am feel sharper and more aggressive than the standard model. The body kit was pure late 90s aggression, a hood scoop that actually worked, ground effects that hugged the pavement, and a rear spoiler that looked fast even when parked. The Trans Am rode on 16-inch wheels, but they were wide and wrapped in sticky rubber that helped put the power down. Inside, the driver faced deeply bolstered seats and a steering wheel that felt thick and purposeful. The shifter for the manual transmission had short throws and a mechanical precision that made every gear change satisfying. Pontiac offered the Trans Am in colors like navy blue metallic and sunset orange, but the most iconic was Arctic white with blue graphics. The Ram air intake system used cooler air from the hood scoop to increase power slightly, but more importantly, it created an intake howl that mixed with the exhaust to create a soundtrack that defined late 90s muscle. The WS6 Trans Am could run with Corvettes in a straight line and embarrass more expensive cars on winding roads. This was Pontiac's last hurrah, and they made it count. Number 9, 1995, Chevrolet Camaro Z28. The Z28 badge carried weight. It meant speed, handling, and a legacy stretching back to the late 60s. The 1995 Camaro Z28 honored that legacy while pushing the F-body platform to new limits. This was Chevrolet proving the Camaro could be more than just a Firebird with a different nose. The LT1 V8 delivered 275 horsepower and 325 pound-feet of torque through either a 6-speed manual or 4-speed automatic transmission. 0 to 60 happened in just over 5 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the high 13-second range. But the Z28 was about more than straight-line speed. The suspension was tuned for balance, with stiffer springs and dampers that controlled body roll without beating you to death on bad roads. The Z28 wore specific 17-inch wheels and low-profile performance tires that helped it corner with confidence. The brakes were upgraded to handle repeated hard stops from high speeds. Inside, the seats held you firmly in place through aggressive cornering, and the leather-wrapped steering wheel provided excellent feedback. The gauge cluster was clear and easy to read, with a tachometer that swept clockwise as the LT1 climbed toward redline. Chevrolet offered the Z28 in both coupe and convertible forms, with colors ranging from subdued dark purple metallic to eye-catching bright aqua metallic. The functional hood vents and unique graphics package set the Z28 apart from lesser Camaros. The exhaust note was aggressive without being obnoxious, a deep rumble that rose to a mechanical howl under acceleration. The Z28 proved the fourth-generation Camaro could deliver genuine sports car performance in a package that looked like pure American muscle. This was the Camaro that reminded everyone why the nameplate mattered. Number 8, 1999, Ford Mustang SVO Cobra. 1999 should have been a victory lap for Ford's special vehicle team. Instead, it became a scandal that somehow made the Cobra more legendary. Ford claimed the '99 Cobra made 320 horsepower from its 4.6-liter dual overhead cam V8. Dyno tests revealed the truth. Most were making closer to 280. Ford issued a recall, bought back cars, and offered serious compensation. The shame was real, but so was the foundation for redemption. Even with the power deficit, the '99 Cobra was seriously quick. 0 to 60 took around 5.6 seconds, and the quarter mile passed in the low 14-second range. The independent rear suspension gave the Cobra handling that embarrassed solid axle competitors. The brakes were massive 13-inch rotors that could scrub speed repeatedly. The transmission was a Tremec T 45 5-speed with mechanical precision and short throws. The Cobra wore aggressive 17-inch wheels and performance rubber that helped it corner with surprising confidence. The body kit was subtle but effective, with a lowered stance and functional aerodynamics. Inside, Leather seats and white-faced gauges created an upscale environment that separated the Cobra from base Mustangs. The exhaust note was subdued compared to pushrod competitors, but the dual overhead cam engine had a mechanical precision that felt sophisticated. Ford offered the 99 Cobra in colors like laser red and Atlantic green, but the most striking was chrome yellow with black accents. Despite the power controversy, the 99 Cobra laid the groundwork for the 2000 model, which Ford supercharged as an apology and turned into one of the deadliest Mustangs ever built. The 99 Cobra's legacy is complicated, but it proved Ford was committed to building genuine performance cars, even when they stumbled along the way. Number 7. 1997 Chevrolet Corvette. The C5 Corvette arrived in 1997 as a complete reimagining of America's sports car. Gone was the C4's harsh ride and dated interior. The C5 was refined, sophisticated, and faster than any Corvette before it. This was Chevrolet proving they could build a world-class sports car that didn't apologize to anyone. The LS1 V8 produced 345 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque, channeled through either a 6-speed manual with short throws and precise gates, or an optional 4-speed automatic. 0 to 60 took just 4.7 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the low 13-second range at over 100 miles per hour. Top speed stretched past 170, making the C5 one of the fastest production cars you could buy. The chassis was completely new, with a hydroformed frame that was both lighter and stiffer than the C4's. The suspension used transverse leaf springs, a Corvette tradition, but with modern geometry that delivered balanced handling and a surprisingly compliant ride. The brakes were massive, with 12-inch rotors that could haul the Corvette down from triple-digit speeds without fade. The aerodynamics were slippery with a drag coefficient that helped the LS1 push the Corvette through air efficiently. Inside, the C5 finally gave Corvette buyers an interior worthy of the car's performance. Real leather, supportive seats, and clear gauges created an environment that felt special. The hatchback provided surprising cargo space, making the Corvette a legitimate grand touring machine. The exhaust note was sophisticated, a deep rumble that rose to a mechanical scream as the LS1 climbed toward its 6,000 RPM redline. Chevrolet offered the C5 in colors ranging from Arctic white to fairway green metallic, but the most iconic was torch red. The C5 Corvette proved American engineers could build a sports car that matched European competitors for handling while exceeding them for straight-line speed and value. This was the Corvette that silenced critics and established the template for every Corvette that followed. Number 6. 1993 Ford Mustang SVT Cobra. Before the power controversy of '99, there was the 1993 SVT Cobra, and it was glorious. This was Ford's first full production run of the modern Cobra, and they didn't hold back. The 5.0-liter V8 was massaged to produce 235 horsepower and 280 pound-feet of torque, numbers that don't sound impressive until you remember the base GT made just 205 horsepower. That extra 30 horsepower came from GT, 40 high-flow cylinder heads, a special camshaft, and a less restrictive exhaust system. 0 to 60 took just over 5.6 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the mid-14-second range. The real improvement was handling. The Cobra rode on 17-inch wheels with wide performance rubber and featured an upgraded suspension with thicker anti-roll bars and specific shock valving. The result was a Mustang that could actually corner without the tail getting nervous. The Cobra wore unique front and rear fascias with functional brake cooling ducts and an aggressive appearance that separated it from standard Mustangs. Side scoops and a rear spoiler added visual drama while actually improving aerodynamics. The exhaust note was pure pushrod American V8, a deep rumble at idle that rose to a mechanical roar under acceleration. Inside, leather seats and white-faced gauges created an upscale environment. Ford built just under 5,000 Cobras for 1993, split between coupes and convertibles. The color palette included teal, vibrant red, and black, each with unique striping. The '93 Cobra proved the Fox body platform still had life, even as Ford prepared to launch the next-generation Mustang. This was the Cobra that established the template: more power, better handling, aggressive looks, and a price that made sense. It was the foundation for every performance Mustang that followed. Number 5, 1996, Chevrolet Corvette Grand Sport. Chevrolet built the Grand Sport to honor the legendary race cars of the 60s, and they created something truly special. The 1996 Corvette Grand Sport combined the base LT1 V8 with aggressive aerodynamics, wider bodywork, and exclusive colors that made it instantly recognizable. Only 1,000 Grand Sports were built, all of them in Admiral Blue with a white stripe and red hash marks, or black with similar graphics. The LT1 produced 330 horsepower and 340 pound-feet of torque, the same as the standard Corvette, but the Grand Sport wore wider wheels, 11 inches in front and 11.5 in the rear, wrapped in aggressive Goodyear rubber. The suspension was specifically tuned for the wider track, with stiffer springs and dampers that controlled the extra grip. 0 to 60 took just over 4.7 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the high 12-second range. The Grand Sport's body was pure aggression. Flared fenders covered the wider wheels, creating a muscular stance that looked ready to pounce. The front brake cooling ducts were functional, channeling air to the massive rotors. The rear featured unique taillights and graphics that honored the original Grand Sport race cars. Inside, every Grand Sport received unique embroidery on the seats and a numbered plaque on the console. The exhaust note was classic small block, smooth and sophisticated at cruise, rising to a mechanical scream at wide-open throttle. The Grand Sport could corner with ferocity, the wide tires and tuned suspension allowing speeds that would terrify lesser Corvettes. Chevrolet offered the Grand Sport as both a coupe and convertible, though the coupe was more popular with collectors. Today, Grand Sports command serious premiums over standard C4 Corvettes, and clean examples are increasingly rare. This was Chevrolet's love letter to racing heritage, wrapped in fiberglass and painted in colors that demanded attention. Number 4, 1992, Dodge Stealth R/T Turbo. Dodge and Mitsubishi's partnership produced something genuinely exotic, the Stealth R/T Turbo. While the Mitsubishi 3000 GT VR4 got most of the attention, the Dodge version offered identical performance with distinctive American styling. The 1992 Stealth R/T Turbo was a technological showcase that embarrassed cars costing twice as much. The 3.0-liter V6 featured twin turbochargers, dual overhead cams, and 4 valves per cylinder, producing 300 horsepower and 307 pound-feet of torque. That power flowed through either a 5-speed manual or 4-speed automatic to an all-wheel drive system that could vary power front to rear. 0 to 60 took just 5 seconds flat, and the quarter-mile passed in the high 13-second range. Top speed was electronically limited to 155 miles per hour. The technology list read like science fiction: electronically controlled suspension with sport and tour modes, 4-wheel steering that improved both low-speed maneuverability and high-speed stability, active aerodynamics with a rear spoiler that deployed at speed, and anti-lock brakes with enormous rotors. The body was sleek and low, with pop-up headlights and a fastback roofline that looked exotic from every angle. Inside, the Stealth featured deeply bolstered leather seats, a full digital gauge cluster, and controls for the various electronic systems. The exhaust note was subdued, almost refined, but the twin turbos created a rush of boost that pushed you back in the seat. The Stealth could corner with confidence, the all-wheel drive and 4-wheel steering allowing speeds that would overwhelm rear-drive competitors. Dodge offered the Stealth in colors like Stealth Gray and Viper Red, but the most iconic was bright white with red accents. This was American muscle, reimagined through Japanese technology, and it worked beautifully. Number 3, 1996, Ford Mustang S VT Cobra Mystic. Ford's special vehicle team created something truly special for 1996, the Mystic Cobra. This limited edition featured paint that changed color depending on viewing angle and lighting, shifting from green to purple to gold to brown. Only 2004 Mystic Cobras were built, making them among the rarest modern Mustangs. Under the color-shifting paint lived the same 4.6-liter dual overhead cam V8 as the standard 96 Cobra, producing 235 horsepower and 285 pound-feet of torque. 0 to 60 took just over 5.6 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the mid-14-second range. The independent rear suspension gave the Cobra handling that solid axle Mustangs couldn't match. The brakes were 13-inch ventilated discs that provided strong, fade-free stopping power. The Mystic paint was applied over a black base coat, and each car required extensive hand labor to achieve the color-shifting effect. The paint wasn't just rare, it was fragile, requiring specific care to maintain its appearance. The wheels were polished 17-inch units wrapped in performance rubber. Inside, every Mystic Cobra received black leather seats with unique embroidery and a numbered badge on the console. The exhaust note was refined, the dual overhead cam engine lacking the raw bark of pushrod competitors, but offering a sophisticated mechanical precision. The Mystic Cobra could corner aggressively, the independent rear suspension keeping the tail planted through fast sweepers. Ford's special vehicle team proved they could build limited editions that collectors would cherish. Today, Mystic Cobras command enormous premiums, and clean examples rarely come to market. This was automotive art combined with genuine performance, wrapped in paint that seemed to move even when the car was standing still. Number 2, 1999, Pontiac Trans Am WS6 Ram Air. The 1999 Trans Am represented the absolute pinnacle of F-body performance before GM killed the platform. The LS1 V8 with Ram air induction produced 325 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque. But the real story was how it delivered that power. 0 to 60 took just 4.4 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the high 12-second range at nearly 115 miles per hour. These were numbers that embarrassed Corvettes. The WS6 package included functional Ram air induction that pulled cooler air through the hood scoop, performance exhaust with low restriction and high drama, and specific tuning that sharpened throttle response and transmission shift points. The suspension was track-ready, with stiff springs and thick anti-roll bars that controlled body roll through aggressive cornering. The brakes were massive, with ventilated rotors that could handle repeated stops from triple-digit speeds. The body kit was pure late 90s excess, a massive hood scoop, aggressive ground effects, and a rear spoiler that looked fast even in photographs. The Trans Am rode on 16-inch wheels wrapped in wide performance rubber. The exhaust note was unforgettable, a deep rumble that rose to a mechanical scream as the LS1 pulled toward redline. The Ram air system created an intake howl that mixed with the exhaust to produce a soundtrack that defined the era. Inside, deeply bolstered seats held you through hard cornering, and the gauge cluster provided all necessary information at a glance. The shifter for the manual transmission had short, precise throws that made every gear change satisfying. Pontiac offered the Trans Am in colors like bright metallic blue and firethorn red, but the most iconic was Arctic white with blue graphics. The 99 Trans Am was the last great F-body, the final expression of a formula that stretched back decades. It was raw, loud, fast, and absolutely unapologetic. This was Pontiac at their finest. Number 1, 2000 Ford Mustang SVT Cobra R. Ford built the 2000 Cobra R as an apology and a statement. After the horsepower scandal of '99, they created a Cobra that exceeded every promise. Only 300 were built, all in performance red, all with manual transmissions, and none with rear seats or air conditioning. This was a race car with license plates, and it remains the deadliest factory Mustang ever built. The 5.4-liter dual overhead cam V8 produced 385 horsepower and 385 pound-feet of torque, numbers that don't sound overwhelming until you consider the Cobra R weighed hundreds of pounds less than a standard GT. 0 to 60 took just 4.4 seconds, and the quarter-mile passed in the low 13-second range at nearly 110 miles per hour. Top speed stretched past 170, but straight-line speed wasn't the point. The Cobra R featured racing suspension with Bilstein shocks and Eibach springs, massive Brembo brakes with 13-point-inch rotors, and 18-inch BBS wheels wrapped in Goodyear racing rubber. The aerodynamics were functional, with a splitter, side skirts, and a massive rear wing that generated real downforce. The result was a Mustang that could lap road courses faster than cars, costing twice as much. The exhaust note was mechanical and angry. The dual overhead cam V8 screaming toward its 7,000 RPM redline. The shifter had short, notchy throws that required commitment. The seats held you firmly through cornering forces that would throw passengers around in lesser Mustangs. Every control felt purpose-built, from the thick steering wheel to the heavy clutch pedal. Ford sold each Cobra R for $54,000, and buyers had to sign agreements stating they wouldn't flip the car immediately. Today, clean examples command well over $100,000, and they're considered among the most collectible modern Mustangs. The 2000 Cobra R proved Ford could build a world-class performance car when they stopped worrying about comfort and focused entirely on speed. This was the Mustang that proved muscle wasn't dead. It was just getting warmed up. This was American engineering at its finest, raw, focused, and absolutely deadly. The 1990s proved muscle never really died. It evolved, adapted, and came roaring back stronger than before. These 16 machines weren't just transportation. They were statements of intent, rolling thunder that reminded everyone why American V8s mattered. From subtle factory sleepers to limited edition weapons that embarrassed exotics, these cars proved horsepower and heritage were alive and well. Which of these 90s legends would you take for one last drive down an empty highway? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you love stories from the era when muscle came screaming back to life, hit subscribe. The best stories are always just beginning.